So hello everybody, I'm Cliff Joslyn. We've been chatting a little bit here from the Pacific Northwest National Lab as we were discussing that's in Richland, Washington, in the southeast corner of Washington State, the dry part. There's a small office in Seattle, Washington, which is where I actually work. So I come to you from 9 time zones away, and I'm here. And my head's on my shoulders and everything. I just want to say how really pleased I am to be back here after such a long time. For some of you know, a very long and wonderful collaboration with the University of Brussels, with Francis and his group going back a long, long time. Beginning to when I was a student in Binghamton University, State University of New York at Binghamton, in the Systems Science Department there. Started working with Francis, and then in the subsequent years working with Francis and the late great Valentin Turchin in the Principia Cybernetica project, and then continuing on when I began my career at the Los Alamos National Lab, where we had a confluence of people, including Johan Bolin from here, Marco Rodriguez from here, Luis Rocha, who's a colleague in many areas, through the years of the 1990s into the early 2000s, started to work on the global brain efforts with Francis, and then subsequently as he's evolved with CLEA and now with the Global Brain Institute. It's been a tremendous source of creative engagement and a lot of really positive activities over a long time. I said that I would tell a story of the Q building. So I was a very young and impressionable student working under George Clear at SUNY Binghamton doing a thesis in fuzzy systems theory and possibilistic information theory, all kinds of groovy stuff. And by good fortune, I believe it was IFSA, the International Fuzzy Systems Association, had their meeting at the VUB, and I think it was 1990 or 91 or something like that. And so I got a paper in, and George Clear was here, and I was doing things with Francis as well. One of the very first talks I ever gave in my career was in the Q building over there. I was this fresh young thing. I didn't have much experience at all. And I will remember to my dying day standing in the massive stage of one of these Q building rooms, maybe one of the 3 or the 6, whatever it is, that rotate around in various ways, standing there looking up at these giant lights in this giant auditorium to the 6 people who were down in the front row listening to my tiny little student presentation. And there's this giant dais and a giant microphone, and I would speak, and it would boom across this huge room, and I just kept talking quieter and quieter and quieter as this echoing reverberations. It was quite an experience. So that's my local story. What I have today, so in thinking about how to carry on with you people today, and realizing that there would be a lot of Francis's group here, but then others as well, who have some orientation to the work generally of ECCO and the Global Brain Institute, and having the backgrounds that we do and sort of the legacy around some of these issues, I thought I would think how to structure this kind of talk, and I realized there was no good way except to sort of break it into 2 interesting pieces, I think, that will interact in a particular way. I want to begin with discussing some concepts that I've been carrying around for a long time about how the system science approach, the cybernetics approach to systems modeling can inform an articulate discourse about what a global brain is and what it can be. What we mean by this, how we would identify it if it were present, etc. Again, these are things that I was literally pulling slides from the first Global Brain meeting in 2001 that was held here, and realizing that I didn't really have to change very much about them. I think the issues were just as cogent as the other day. Plus, it was a cheap way to fill some time. So, start off with those kinds of discussions, and then slide into some recent thinking that I've been doing about what is the actual nature of emerging levels of global control. How is information technology over this, in the 10 years since then, or more than 10 years since then, what's actually happening in the world that's showing the signs of the emergence of these global information systems. And the inflection point is around how it actually engages with our research portfolio at the Pacific Northwest National Lab. I definitely want to we've been in discussion with Francis and his group over the past day or so, realizing that there's a lot of specific points of connection around some specific technical areas. So I got way too many slides describing some of the particular technical things that we're doing, and I'll maybe with your help and direction, we can address some of those topics, at least to some depth. And then what I want to close off on is a little discussion about some new mathematical modeling that we're starting to do at PNNL. I don't know if there's any math people out there, but if there are, we can. And I have very few equations, almost none. But I have some nice pictures. Pictures are really good for helping to think about mathematics. So we're doing some things in topological data analysis and sheaf theory, which I think are going to be very important, or I shouldn't say very important. I think they're intriguing, let's just say that, in terms of what it can mean to do complex systems modeling and how to model complex information systems where you have information flows. Francis and I were debating yesterday whether this distinction between structural descriptions and dynamic descriptions, and of course there's an interplay between those. There's, again, this interesting mathematics coming out of topology theory in particular, which I think is informative, certainly of the static side and possibly the dynamic side as well. So, this is one of the slides that I used. It was actually in Barcelona, if you remember our time there. Remember that? Oh, yeah. And so, I mean, this is not that profound. These are sort of basic observations. There's this global emerging infosphere, or the noosphere, as Taylor Deschardin would describe it, which is this unprecedented combination of storage, communication, and computation, of vast size, with multiple modalities, embedding into the complexities of the real world. And of course, that's the important thing, is how do the information networks and our interaction with the information networks actually then go out to affect things in the real world or in terms of real social structures. With this massive presence of multiple interpreting agents at all levels of granularity, from the individual all up to very large collections, entire nations, in fact, entire global structures, with different levels of situatedness, different levels of automation, and given an evolutionary interaction with the global society, to what extent is it justified to bring metaphors and models around intelligence and global brain type concepts to bear on this? It's just a way of describing it. My foundations are in this system science and cybernetics, which is the intellectual movement from the post-war era dedicated to interdisciplinary information systems modeling. It's been largely overcome by events, I would say. Large chunks of system science and cybernetics have now been graduated into multiple technical areas in computer science and economics and biology and all over the world. But as a general matter, I still think it holds as distinct kind of intellectual activity to be able to look at the role that isomorphism plays in modeling. So if I'm looking at physical systems, biological systems, cognitive systems, social systems, what kinds of mechanisms, what kinds of measurements, what kinds of modeling paradigms are useful that are generalizable from one to the other. At one extreme, this becomes basically applied mathematics. I have a formal system, I've got a mathematical theory which I know works well for this ecological system. How might it also work for this ecological system over here? I'm going to make a mapping from the variables I measure in one to the variables I measure in the other, and therefore gain information or make predictions about this one system based upon what I know about this other system. That's been the promise of this kind of thing before. It's taking analogies and making them hard, if you will, which is really what the global brain is about. It's taking the analogy between the brain and the body and applying it to the social level, to the global social level in particular. So, talking about analogies and hard analogies, this is something I've been flirting with for a while. I have some ambitions eventually to truly understand the formal underpinnings for analogy systems. Not serious models at the moment, but sort of analogy systems in general. Body is to mind as hardware is to software, right? That's the ultimate kind of motivation for thinking along these lines. We take the classical philosophical mind-body problem and we say, what is the role that informational processes, software-type processes, have to play in interacting with physical systems and interacting with energy systems? We say that the body is to the mind as the body is to the brain, right? So the role that is played by the information controlling system, which is physically in my brain, is in terms of its functional capacities as a mindful agent. But if we start off with a body-mind analogy, we can't stick to that. We have to take our body-mind analogy and then bring in our brain as well. So we can say that the body is the brain as the brain is to the mind. Or if we say that the body is to the mind as the brain is to the mind. This is not simple, and it's not transparent, and it's And like I say, these are motivating analogies. These are not serious scientific hypotheses at the moment, but they need to be unpacked in order to understand how we actually go about framing these kinds of problems. Beyond that, of course, these don't all work in isolation. If the body is to the brain as the brain is to the mind, then matter is to energy as energy is to information. What are those relationships as well in terms of levels of abstraction in terms of the models that we bring to bear, or in terms of the theories that we can purport and the predictions we can make using those kinds of theories. And it doesn't stop there either. In that context, then, physical type things in our models play the role of entities, as opposed to the relations between the entities, which form our system's descriptions and are much more abstract. And then, in combinations with each other, actually sitting together in complex collections as subgraphs. Now, I'm making analogies here, and I'm making meta-analogies then, between these different analogical systems. That complex combinatorial intermeshing of multiple analogies is something that can be taken too far, and something that can, but on the other hand, something that can actually motivate important realizations, I think. So if entities are to relations as relations are to subgraphs, that's basically a type-token distinction. The tokens are the physical entities. The types are the categories that those fit into, which is an abstraction relationship on the tokens. And then the schemas, or schemata, or ontologies are the way that they interact, how the types and tokens, the entities and relations interact in complex collections in order to represent scenarios or situations. Similarly, you can bring it over to nouns and verbs, at least in Western languages. Noun-verb relations relate together in propositions or predicates or sentences or situations more generally. And then finally, mapping all the way back to the semiotic concepts of syntax regarding the physical interaction among tokens in a system, the semantics meaning their interpretation, and then finally their pragmatics, which is in use of those information structures for interaction with the world. This is sort of the ground that I think is useful in looking at how actual technological or formal models can operate in the context of global brain concepts or elsewhere. We have an abstraction of relationships. We have the origins of control and representation. We were talking about levels of representation as we move along in these analogical systems. A concentration, if you will, of constraints that are in existence, for example, between the verbs and the situations, the semantics and the pragmatics, and the types and the schemas. Emergence of nonlinearities, increase in complexity, and a requirement, most importantly, for hierarchical levels and metasystems of description. If you simply look at everything as matter, or look at everything as entities as opposed to their relations and subgraphs, you need to be able to do that at multiple levels of description at a meta level, above the actual physical things themselves. So, requirement for hierarchical levels and metasystems of descriptions of phenomena and of the models, that is, of the descriptions themselves. So, this is a relatively vague, deliberately vague sort of expression of the kind of the global conceptual framework that you can bring to bear for these kinds of descriptions. It won't surprise you that when we're building our big semantic graph technologies at Pacific Northwest National Lab, this is not the kind of thing that occupies our daily thinking and our day-to-day work. But in a discussion like this, I think it can be valuable to keep these kinds of distinctions in mind as we proceed. So, a little more precisely, when you bring a set of systems descriptions to bear for these kinds of questions, from years ago when we were working at the origins of Principia Cybernetica, as we're learning the basics of system science and cybernetics, we're drawn to a collection of specific kinds of relational schema, if you will, or descriptive schema that outline the way that we interact with phenomena and the kinds of descriptions we can bring to bear on things. And there's two primary relationships. The first of these is a modeling relationship that can exist between systems and their environments. The other, and I might have been better off putting these on one slide, side to side, in order to contrast them, is the control relationship. So you can do an awful lot of work using systems descriptions if you begin with these two ideas in your mind, a modeling relationship and a control relationship. I might have organized these slides a little differently to reflect that. But nonetheless, let's work through them. So in a modeling relationship, what you have is a relationship between a system and its environment. In systems descriptions, we always begin with such distinctions. And In particular, the kind of relationship that exists between the system and the environment is one of measurement. The system interacts with its environment to create some sort of measurement or observation of what's going on in the world. This is a general concept. It can have many specific manifestations. So if I stick a thermometer into a beaker, that's literally taking a measurement. But if I've got a neural system, eyes and ears that are, or touch sensors that are interacting with its environment, or any actual causal interaction between the system and the environment that leaves a record inside the system that records the representation of the state of the environment at a certain point in time. That's generically what we call a representation or a measurement process resulting in representation. From that point forward, however, the system then has to perform prediction. It's got to say, based on what I know about the environment, here's what I think is going to happen in the future, and then check that in an error checking process with a future observation at a future point in time. So we're producing new representations inside the system through a generalized process of prediction in order to compare future representations against past representations. And if you're doing a good model, that means that you have that match. Obviously, this paradigm is generally applicable throughout science, in all cognitive systems, certainly in all of computer science and information science as well. And of course, they stack on each other. What is a representation at one level can become the environment for another embedding system inside. Neural systems are typified by this, where I've got levels of models that are built up inside a system in increasingly higher levels of abstraction. So you get meta-models and meta-meta-models that exist. So this modeling relationship is if you look at the flow, let's look at the topology of this. I begin here at the world, I proceed forward in time, I develop representations from here as well, and everything is flowing in this direction and ends up with an error checking process comparing this representation against the world. It's essentially a linear process. Moving through time this way, the system is taking in information. It is not interacting back into its environment. That's what our control relationship does on the other hand. So in a control relationship, I'm still taking measurements of the system. I have a representation, it moves forward, but then I have an agency that's also attached to the system, which takes an action back into the world, and then the physical processes in the world are such as to produce a new state at a future time, taking another measurement, and then there's this causal interactive loop between the system and its environment affecting it in a dynamic process. So this is fundamentally a cyclic process, a circular process, as opposed to the linear process of modeling. In a general way, this is a negative feedback relationship which results in stability, persistence, or survival of the system. To the extent that that happens, and this is a good control relationship, right? We said, what's a good model? A good model is one that avoids error, and a good control relationship is one that produces stability or survival over time. Yes?
What is the difference between the word on the right and the left?
Nothing. Well, in both cases, I'm showing world and world prime. World prime is the state of the world at a future time. In this case, however, I've got to equivocate a little bit because this is actually a temporal process dynamically inside the system. So this is both world prime and world double prime and triple prime as the thing cycles through. But for any one particular cycle, you take a measurement of the state of the world, as actions back into the world, and then you take another measurement. Now, these are clearly related to each other. Well, wait, there's more to be said. So this is an agency relationship, as we say, which means that there's some freedom, some ability of the system to make an autonomous choice. It's got to make the right choice in order to promote stability and survival. If it makes the wrong choice, it will lead to its self-destruction, potentially. Something else that's very important here is the amplification process that's going on. In a control relationship, this is not simple dynamics. This is not just a system evolving or equilibrating in time into a steady state. This is a system that's actually, by observing something in the world, able to take an action that actually departs from dynamics. It's doing something that you didn't expect it to happen. The ball isn't rolling down the hill and then sitting at the bottom. The ball is trying to keep itself out from the bottom of the bowl, if you will, right? And the fact that it's taking a positive action in the world to build its self-survival and to promote its dynamics is a mark that there's a control relationship actually in operation. Every living cell in your body is an example of this because they're maintaining themselves far from thermodynamic equilibrium. Your whole body is keeping itself far from thermodynamic equilibrium all the time. If it wasn't taking control relationships to maintain itself far from dynamic equilibrium, it would achieve dynamic equilibrium, which is death. That's what it means to be in equilibrium with your environment. So, you need this amplification, this disproportionate nonlinear concentration of action, and because we're taking measurements, you need the ability to bind information to energy. That's the hallmark of what a living system is the ability to, through the genetic codes and neural processes and neural organisms, to be able to exploit information in the environment in order to amplify energetic processes to maintain yourself far from equilibrium. In a nutshell, that's what, at least, it's not sufficient for life, but it's a necessary condition for life to be able to do this. So, in a nutshell, I've given you the basic kind of cyber systems framework for how to think of systems, living systems and complex systems in interaction. Of course, this is hardly the end, this is merely the beginning, and in just 10 minutes, there's a whole lot more that needs to be said. So for example, we're going to be talking about social systems. So in social systems, you have social control. It's not just one system interacting with its environment, it's multiple systems interacting with a common environment. Now, my loop, my causal loop of control is interacting with the world jointly with, which includes other actors. So the question is, how is conflict and coordination managed amongst those joint actors, systems of controllers in breadth? Long ago, when we were studying Bill Power's living control systems, for example, there is this, you can make this argument, you can make this debate whether social control in breadth like this, how that it can be compared to hierarchical control, which is the other primary form of organization. Remember we talked about meta models, where you build up higher and higher levels of modeling. You can also build up higher and higher levels of control relationships, cyclic control relationships. Or I've got an inner controller, which is controlling the choices of a lower level controller that's operating at a slower time scale, which then in turn operates with the world. This is how our bodies are organized. I've got very fast responses at the level of reflexes, interacting with my spinal cord to my hand and keeping me standing up straight here like this. And then hopefully there's some kind of thought going on in the brain which is determining how I'm going to be speaking over the next time. So these are hierarchical levels of control interacting. So that's a complex interaction on multiple levels as distinct from parallel, it's not hierarchical, it's parallel interaction between me and all of you in this room. So what does it mean for a collection to create a hierarchy so that there can be some sort of global control over a collection of actors? We think that's what's going on, for example, in a corporation. You elect a president, or in an army, you have a general, and the general decides and controls what all the movements of the various units are within there. But that's mediated through a set of social conventions, etc. There are serious questions. I'm not as much of a student of this theory as I should be, and I know Francis in particular, you've studied this and written on this at some depth. I don't know if there's any more recent developments of that debate as to, but I'm standing here as a bit of a skeptic in terms of the ability to describe social phenomena in terms of, in the same terms that you would apply to an individual organism. The argument is probably best articulated in the context of eusocial animals, bees and wasps and naked mole rats, etc., to the extent that they divide labor and actually divide physical phenotypes amongst a population, to what extent you can, but we don't think of the queen bee as the controller. The queen bee is not deciding the actions for the beehive. That control is distributed throughout the beehive. So in terms of eusocial organization is a close relationship to the kinds of phenomena that we'd be looking to identify for saying we're a global brain movement. Yes?
I don't know if you can ask questions.
Of course. Yes. Absolutely.
If you assume that the hive is sort of acting out of control with the queen bee not being in control, maybe another way of viewing the same thing could be that the queen makes the bees with her genes.
Yes.
And the genes of the drones. And that the hive is a flying interface for the queen. So the queen is in control of her interface and fights with other queens by means of...
Maybe. If so, and I'm sitting here, again, I'm not a student of eusocial organization, I don't know. What I am saying is that you would need to be able to identify these relationships then in the beehive. Where is if the workers are interacting with its environment and they're bringing things back, what are the communication processes, what are the measurement processes, what are the control actions that are being taken by the hive, and how are those mediated through hierarchical levels of control? This is a paradigm for the scientific program of what you would need to identify to match to a theory of that kind of organization.
What he suggests would not work in the control system because there's no feedback. The queen cannot change her behavior
that would be my
if
thinking.
things go wrong.
That would be my thinking.
The genes of the queen make the bees and all their reflexes.
Yeah, but they can't take it. They can't correct if those genes do not do their work. If the
environment
do their
changes.
work, they can't change the.
No, I
genes.
know. But the selection is possibly on a number of colonies made by a number of.
But that's an
queens.
evolutionary process.
That's
not
an
a control
evolutionary process. It's not a control process. So the control process runs as it is made by the queen, and if it's not good enough, another queen will sort of produce more new queens and produce a new control system.
That's
Yeah, but so
evolutionary.
it's not really a
It's not
control
the same.
by the
It's
queen.
not the same level.
The analogy would have to be, it's not that the queen, it's not brain is to body as queen is to hive. The analogy would be that each bee is a neuron, and the entire hive is like an organism
But like
with a
like-
distributed control. In other words, but there's no brain. But there's no brain for that body. The
Like-
entire body is a brain to that extent.
Like our neurons are made by our genes,
Yeah.
the bees as neurons are made by the genes of the queen.
Yes, but my genes don't control my thought.
But
At least
they-
not
no,
on a
they-
moment-to-moment
They
basis.
don't control your thoughts, but they do control the behavior of the neuron. So your
No.
genes,
No,
your
no,
genes,
they don't.
It's the difference between command and control. They command, but they don't control.
I know.
Control means that there is a feedback so that they
Yeah.
can correct if their command is not doing.
Genetic expression is the wrong time scale.
That's an
Genetic
interesting-
expression is at the scale of milliseconds to seconds. Neural operation is microseconds. It's very different.
An interesting confusion of paradigms we have here.
Well, and at this point of the talk, what I'm saying is that I think what the systems perspective provides is the way to categorize the arguments. You can seek to identify what your measurement process is, what are the actions, and then see how you can make those mappings. That's the value of this kind of rigorous approach. So, ultimately, when you combine together, when in real systems, in real complexes, and I'm sorry I'm going back and forth here, these different diagrams inform each other in different ways. In real complex systems, living systems, models and controls are combined, necessarily. I got an internal model, and it's the model that's making predictions that will allow me to understand what action to take. It's my knowledge of the world that lets me figure out I need to go here and not there. I need to take this action in a control relationship to maintain stability and survival based upon my knowledge of my models. So these models and controls interact, they work together across hierarchical levels. So that's the ultimate cybernetic paradigm for complex systems organization. So bring that to the global level, yes.
Let's say control does only work when sufficiently deeply consistent models are there.
Not necessarily. No, you do not. A thermostat has a very shallow model and can be a very effective control. In complex living systems, yes, but pure control systems can be extremely simple. Couple of differential equations, and that's it. So when we bring this paradigm to the question of looking at global phenomena, global brain type phenomena, what do we have? We've got our environment, we have our system with multiple interacting agents. Each of our interacting agents is its own control system. They're organized in hierarchical complex relationships. Society of many anticipatory controllers operating in breadth. A hierarchy of many anticipatory controllers also operating in depth. Mutual exchanging information, interpreting semantic information. Pragmatically coupled to the world. Remember, our control relations involves a pragmatic coupling to the energetics of the world. Through sensors, memory, and effectors, performing actions as a whole system for the viable survival of the system. I think, in order to identify the global level as a cybernetic control system, this is what we would need to identify. So, what a global brain could be. What a brain is to its body, a complete control system at the neural level, pragmatically coupled to the world through sensors, neural memory, and effectors, to perform actions as a whole organism. So a global brain would be a complete control system at the level of humans and human organizations, pragmatically coupled to the globe through human input data sources and effectors to perform actions as a whole superorganism. And in discussions with Francis and discussions with others, I mean, it's too broad a set of questions to say yes, no, but rather to, as we examine the phenomena in the globally emerging information technology world, to try to map them back to these concepts. What are the avenues for representation, for modeling, for communication, and for control relations among arbitrarily scaled collections of humans, mediated through their computer-supported communication, in order to have that system operate viably for its survival over an evolutionary timescale. This is obviously of great concern because there's a lot of suggestions that we are not operating for the viable survival of any kind of global superorganism. As I say, I'm a bit of a skeptic and I'm a bit of a cynic at this point, quite honestly, yes.
Just about one word, complete.
Okay, sure. All right.
Everything else.
That's fine. It's a good Clash song, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, what do you mean by complete?
I don't know. Forget complete. Incomplete. Incomplete control is probably, but any kind of control. How's that?
Sufficient control.
Sufficient. Very good. I like that.
Sufficient for
Sufficient
survival.
I grant you the.
But all the rest can be free.
I grant you that. Okay, so enough of the philosophical hand waving. I like to put my cards on the table. Okay, and we're well into the talk. So let's start to look at some of these. The rest of this won't be, this section won't be new to anybody. I just want to talk about some current events and some current technologies. So there's a whole bunch of these emerging technologies that the group here, many of which the group here works with, some of which my lab works with as well, involving increase of complexity of semantic representations at a global level, all of which will facilitate this view that I put out there. So obviously our semantic web technologies first and foremost. Francis is saying that they're actually sort of falling away from semantic web technologies proper, but I still work very strongly in this field. So this is ontological representations, OWL and RDF and Sparkle as a semantic graph paradigm. In the technical slides I've got, I talk a little about some of those details if you want to get into that kind of thing. And this might be broadly known to some of you out there, maybe not to others, but it's the ability, basically the ability to represent knowledge and actually to make actual knowledge representations available in the web, to be available for interpretation by artificial intelligence agents and by humans. So you're not just doing a Google search, you're doing an intelligent Google search in the form of a sentence, for example, where it's actually, there's a deep knowledge base behind it where it attaches a lot of meaning to individual terms, not just doing keyword matching. Movement towards, there's been some skepticism because, as we were joking yesterday, like flying cars and fusion power, it's always 30 years off. The Semantic Web article, the primary paper came out in 2001 in Scientific American. They promised the future, and it's been slow in coming. There are some moves I mentioned here, schema.org and the growth of RDFA are two of the technical innovations that are pushing this now into the a lot of current stuff. So, for example, you're not going to find RDF markup or a lot of this stuff actually existing in current websites. They've shied away from adopting it. They're still at the keyword level, but slowly it's starting to come in different ways. Something that we had dealt with a while back, and this slide is neat. It turns out, I didn't bring it with me, I should have.
Mm-hmm.
I said I would. A particular issue of the communications of the ACM, October 2013, had a ton of these articles that just happened to involve a lot of these things around global brain technologies that I think are really interesting. So this is a description of the argument web. In the argument web, instead of just information about objects and relations, and so, Cliff is a person, that's the kind of thing you'd stick into the semantic web, the ontological information about the terms. You also throw in stuff about arguments, about discourse, about claims and refutations and evidence and things like this. Concepts that Francis and I were playing with years ago, and which have been out there in the academic literature and maybe starting to come in at a higher level. So we've got the complexity of the semantic representations, a collection of new data resources coming along. Mark Reeves, who's Director of Analytics at Pacific Northwest National Lab, was involved with getting the Wikidata project off of the table. So basically what you do is you take Wikipedia and you scrape all the tables out of Wikipedia, and you make a giant fact base of all of that stuff, and then you make it available to be also modified by Wiki Technologies in the same way. So this is an article we're going to have out in CACN and Press right now. It's very, I think, a very powerful thing. We're getting a lot of good buzz around that. Something that we're playing with at Pacific North National Lab, in the systems biology movement, there's a real move to get all kinds of biological databases online. We're working with a data set out of Colorado University of Denver with 10 billion triples, representing all kinds of known facts about genes and gene products and how they interact with biological processes. So in certain domains like biology, these resources are coming online. Data.gov is a huge resource of open source government information held by the US government. And I think there's a similar UK version of this, although I forget what the acronym is. I don't know if the European Union is going to get into this world either, of getting all of their basically open source information actually physically online. Right now, the data.gov is rather primitive. We're trying to make it more intelligent. This is Jim Hendler's effort out of Rensselaer Polytechnic. Basically, right now, it's just a massive collection of CSV spreadsheets that's pushed out into the world and no markup and no intelligence. It's a challenge trying to do this right. Movement towards the Internet of Things. I know you guys are talking about this as well. Here's another article from that same issue of the CACM. The joke here always is I don't really know what my toothbrush wants to say to my refrigerator. I'm not sure I want them doing it, but certainly with medical devices and in certain areas, being able to have automated interaction amongst our machines clearly can be a good thing. And then I assume you guys have seen the Programming the Global Brain from CACM, although I know Bernstein a little bit.
He is coming to speak next week.
Oh, really? Interesting. So he might not remember me. He might. I've met him at various ISWICs and things like that. I was somewhat unimpressed by this particular article just because of the, I don't know, it's basically about how we can deploy software technologies to enable social interaction around programming, as opposed to what it would mean to have those being deployed in the world doing global control at a global level. I don't know. Maybe I misinterpreted that. He's very strong. Excellent computer scientist, really well respected in the.
Well, I was considering making him another member of the advisory board of the GPI.
I would love to spend some time with him. I last interacted with him around, they had a graph programming model that they were, it's probably what helped inform this and what we're talking about. Yeah. He's in Switzerland, right?
Yep.
Excellent. So there's just some things that I've come across recently that are, if as you look back at it, you realize, oh, tremendous potential for these things to be actually bringing about these kinds of global interactive control systems that we're talking about. But, and this is, we were arguing about this over lunch and dinner yesterday as well. Like I say, first of all, I'm an American, right? And so things are evolving in a particular way in my country right now. Also, I work for a top secret government laboratory, and I do all kinds of interesting things for them. And so I've got a particular perspective on things, and I watch things from my viewpoint. And we were joking yesterday about how there's so many utopian visions of how these information technologies will enable human freedom and creativity and foster freedom and democracy and all these kinds of things. But there's also a dystopian vision of the world as well, which is available there. So I'm about to unload some of that on you. And I think I'll try to defend the idea that I think we are actually beginning to see an emergence of actual global control systems. And I'm not sure I entirely like what I see. So what actually controls global human action? That's really the question. Remember, we're talking about pragmatic coupling, right? In their control relationship, I got to be taking an action. I got to go to the food and avoid the waste, right? This is what I got to do. This is good to eat. That's not good to eat. If I go this way, I'm going to survive and have more kids. If I go that way, I'm going to die and not have any more kids. This is the evolutionary imperative behind what it means to be a viable control system. So this is happening at the global level. What actually controls global human action? What binds information to large movements at the global scale? Now, as we talk about binding information to energetics, that's what it means to be in a measurement control of
I'm not
with your
quite sure
environment.
what you mean to bind information to large movements.
Of matter, of energy, and of people. In other words, at an informational level, choices that are made by systems which have an effect in the world to control large movements of matter, energy, and people. Right? That's what it means to be operating in a cybernetic control relationship at a global level. At a local level, it's clear. I'm moving my legs. I'm making decisions about what job to take. I'm interacting with my colleagues. At the local level, we understand that. At the corporate level, we can sort of understand that. We're making a decision to invest in this technology or to expand a plant here or something like this. What does it mean at the global level to bind information to large movements of matter, energy, and people? What is actually doing that? Even to the point of terraforming. Talking about global scale, global level. And of course, what is the ultimate informational abstraction for global control? I think you can see where I'm heading. It's money. I will debate this with anybody here. I'm not an economist. I'm a lowly systems thinker. And I know that nobody wants to admit this. And I'm not advocating this. I'm trying to describe what I see.
Well, let me abstract your proposal, let's say, about values. For some people, the biggest value is money. For other people, there are other values that are more important than money.
That is not germane to what I'm saying. That is true, and that's admirable, and I think I'm also one of those people, and we all want to be those people. Nobody wants to say they're not one of those people. It is simply not germane to what I'm saying. I'm saying, what is the information abstraction? In a sense, money is the ultimate information abstraction. It's pure number. It's pure number which has tremendous power. It has the ability to blow up mountains. It has the ability to kill millions of people.
What about religion?
Excuse me?
What about religion?
I might give you that as that's a good challenge. That's a better challenge than Francis. That's a
No, it falls under my category.
Okay, so of course, money is an abstraction, right? It's a kind of a pure abstraction. Abstraction by itself does not do anything. Abstraction has to be coupled to decisions in order to take actions. So in financial systems, that's what money does. In other kinds of, it is not the only thing, obviously, that can do that. Especially because people were terraforming and moving matter and energy long before money existed, right? Over evolutionary time. So it is not necessary that money be that. What I'm saying is that so the ability of religious movements to control large amounts of matter, energy, and people without engaging financial systems, I think is exceptional and limited. So for example, you can take down buildings without a lot of cash. The 9/11 plotters, it was not a large financial action that they were taking. But that's, I think, somewhat exceptional. It's a good argument. I don't think that would change. I don't think even if I were to simply accept that uncritically, I don't think it would change what I'm saying here either.
It cannot be quantified in the same manner that money is.
And it's
No, but the quantification is not the definition of information. Information is abstraction.
Information is abstraction.
Religion is abstract.
That's right. Francis is right about that. So the fact that money is pure abstraction and that it's quantified does not mean that all abstractions need to be quantified.
Yeah, but it's not just any abstraction. It's an abstraction in the context of global control. It's not, I agree that it is an abstraction, but what allows you to quantify it, why quantify it? Quantify it just in order to facilitate control.
I don't think quantification is necessary. I don't think quantification is necessary. I suspect that quantification is helpful, but I doubt that it's necessary. In part because I take Clement's point that there are other abstractions that can also move large amounts of matter, energy, and people. That doesn't change the fact that it is a powerful, probably certainly the most powerful of all those abstractions.
Religion and money are both a shared code. You can say that. It's a shared code, social code.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But there are other emerging ones that are better than either money or religion.
When you say better, that's implying...
Better from our point of view.
Okay, so remember, I'm not attempting to be prescriptive. I'm attempting to be descriptive. As the internet evolves, as our economy evolves with it, as we pass 7 billion people in a technological environment on a limited ecological planet, and as we test the ecological limits, and as we perhaps plummet to our doom, to the extent that global action is taking place, mediated through these control relationships, I would actually prefer to be in a world where the governing abstraction, shockingly, I would prefer to be in a world where the governing abstraction is money than the governing abstraction being religion. If I had to choose between a theocratic and a plutocratic world,
I agree.
I think I would choose the plutocratic. So it's not about what we want, it's not about our values. Your first objection was we don't want to be the kind of people for which this is true. Well, we unfortunately are in a world where we don't get to make that choice. Okay, so wonderful argument. I would let's at least take it for the moment at least that it is an extraordinarily powerful abstraction, if not the most powerful abstraction amongst a very small number of such abstractions that are currently creating the reality of global control. And I'm talking about to the point of terraforming. We are terraforming this planet because of economic forces. I think that's undoubtedly true. Yes?
But wouldn't it be possible to kind of find other abstractions that where both money and religion actually can fit in?
I think that would be by far the worst thing of all. Oh my God!
What I
Can you
mean is that
imagine some Sharia bank somewhere that's
I can
controlling?
only
Oh my
see
God!
money working as a global control if it mobilizes things. So you buy services, you buy whatever. And I see the same with religion, that the thing that religion can do is mobilize.
Yeah.
So I actually prefer the term of mobilization system Francis has been trying to work on.
All right.
As a better abstraction than money or religion
Again,
as a
okay.
global control.
Okay.
A mobilization system we define as something that motivates and coordinates people to act in a certain way.
Sure.
In a certain direction. Money is a mobilization system, religion is another one, but Wikipedia is also a mobilization system.
Science is a mobilization system according to Latour.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
if you actually look at things that you can measure, and I put up there physical movements of matter, deployment of energy, and movements of people.
okay.
Which of these motivation systems are actually effective in carrying out those actions? Certainly in the past, religion has been an incredibly powerful such motivating system, right? Literally thousands of people move across the country in the name of religion, across the world. Conquistadors had both, though. They had both. In fact, they were exploiting the religion for their monetary motivations. They become conflated in history in many specific instances.
Can we put human desire in this discussion, probably? In the
But
sense
that's not a
that
control system.
but
because
it motivates people to do things.
Yeah,
And then you get control systems from that because you want to, as a desire, you want to control the world.
yeah, but the global control system needs to mobilize the desires. The desires are there already, they are not global, they are local, they're just individual. So what we are looking for is some abstraction at the collective level. Some abstraction that can mobilize the desires of lots of people all around the world.
Go back to the beehive argument. If we want to look at the beehive as a single organism, with all of its bees interacting like neurons, we have to look at the globe as a single system. The people in the globe are its neurons, if you will, and interacting with our computers now, through our computers. And the question is, what actions are taking place at the global level? We know that what's happening at the global level is that we have taken over all the arable land, we have burped out all the carbon, or we are about to finish burping out all the carbon, and we are terraforming the planet in doing so. This is a global action which is supported by the science motivation system because it allowed the industrial development, which when coupled with financial exploitation, is actually affecting these actions. That's what happened. That's what happened over the past 500 years.
Do you assume there is a system outside us that affects our activity? In
No.
a sense, because
There is nothing outside the planet that
assuming a
affects us.
metaphysical personality.
It's a constant. There's no variable environment in which we are interacting. I mean, unless something extraordinary happened, like a black hole passes through, or there's an X-ray burst or something like that, barring, or the aliens come and save us, right?
Yeah. But if
These
you don't- if you
are.
don't
This
assume
is
that-
this is silly. This is
If
not.
you don't assume that, I'm not saying something silly. I'm saying if you have individuals, they make up the system.
Mhm.
If we assume something above the system, what is that if we are talking about it, that it can affect us?
But that's the whole global brain idea. There is some emergent
Yeah, yeah.
organization that affects us.
Yeah, but it affects us because we make it. So it's still us making it.
We've always
the
been
same argument as saying that the atoms make the molecule, but the molecules control the atoms.
Yeah, but there are certain, well, then I have to come back to the operator hierarchy, in the sense that there are certain rules for why a unity of elements becomes a unity. That you have like a school of fish, it has some...
Humans have always interacted in society.
Yeah, but if
We're
society...
Hold on, we're hyper-social creatures. We're not eusocial, we're hyper-social in our own way. That has been the case throughout our evolution. There's never been a time when humans have not been engaged, explicitly embedded in our broader social context. The fact that now expands to 7 billion people over planetary spatial scope, that is not new. The fact that it's mediated at now at the speed of light with zettabytes of information backing us up, that is new. That's not qualitatively new, that's quantitatively new. So I don't think that the argument that says that we are components of a system and that there's a systems formation around us for which there's a causal interplay between us as individuals and our embedding context, that is not new. That has always been the case. It's of a different nature now, certainly a different quantitative nature.
Yeah, you in the beginning you said like you were going to discuss when that object that we then call sort of the global brain is there and when it is not there. And I think that is then the point of discussion that we could enter into, in the sense like when do all the individuals create something that we now call a global brain? So what are the characteristics that define that unity of the global brain? And
so
I would like to hear...
And I'm simply distinguishing what you might call tribal brain from global brain. So throughout human history, prehistory, human origins and evolution, we lived as, our great evolutionary story of humans is living in nomadic hunter-gatherer bands of about 100 people, 200 people, something like that, which had a distinct tribal identity. And your language and your customs and your worldview were embedded in that tribal thing. So that has always been true for all of human history. The difference now, when we move to the global brain, is that becomes universalized. Our tribe becomes universalized to the entire tribe.
Where is the brain in this discussion?
Well, my position, I've been challenging, but my whole point here has been to challenge the idea that there could be a distinct locus of control within that global structure such that that would be the brain.
You are not assuming the homunculus.
I know where it is.
Certainly not.
I know where it is, in the cloud.
Yeah, maybe, but then what is it exactly? I'm just asking open questions.
Or either that, or it's...
Cliff is the wrong person to ask because he's not sure himself. You should ask me afterwards.
Francis will tell you later. But if you let me go on, I'm making some observations here that might point in the direction of what's actually happening. Yes?
Just because the money is still bothering me.
Yes.
I think if you can show where it is not a global control, it's kind of a counter-argument. I think that the counter-argument is the software development, where you see that they have been trying to throw money against software development to gain control. I think the dot-com crisis. And it simply didn't create the control over the software developers they intended.
I'm not saying money is sufficient for control.
No,
I'm talking about
global control.
I'm not saying money is necessary for... okay.
I would like to argue that money actually fails as a global control.
Let me articulate this.
Okay.
So Clement's challenge was that money is not necessary control. There are other of these motivating systems, and I would grant that. And I would argue back to you that nor is money sufficient control. You can't just solve problems by throwing money at them. There are many problems that will resist financial solutions. I'm not making either of those arguments here. I'm not trying. You're helping me not make either of those arguments here. What I'm trying to argue here is that there is an information abstraction, it is involved in control relations, and it is operating at the global level. And it's here now.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. And the only thing I would like to add to that is that money shows that it's a good control regulator as long as it's not global. And as soon as things become global, you see that the money system starts failing. And that's what I'm trying to
Okay, that's a good thesis. I hope you're right.
That's it.
But here's your analogy system. Mind is to body as internet is to economy.
Okay.
So that's the consequence, that would be the consequence of what I'm putting up here. At the social level, finance binds information to energy and matter. And you're starting to see emerging financial control and the rise of digital currencies, and the ultimate information abstraction, literally. And then some observations just from some popular social observers that have been on the market recently. The argument, I don't know if you guys track this, you might not, the net neutrality argument in America now is becoming very significant. Basically not treating internet as a common carrier, but rather allowing internet to be controlled by market segments and by powerful players in the market to be not government regulated, but just simply price regulated on an open market, basically. This is a very serious challenge to the free flow of information in my country.
Soap pipa?
Sorry?
Soap pipa, is it this? No, the bills, no.
So,
Soap and
the
pipa,
old-
those are two bills being...
Oh, those are gone.
Is
Soap
that what you're talking
soap
about?
is dead.
No, but is it this what you're talking about?
No,
No.
No,
It's
okay,
the
that's
fact
fine.
that you may pay for a quicker connection. So the information that will be shown will be the ones who can pay for that,
Right.
and the other ones will come at the end.
In other words,
So
the
no
question
one will
is,
know.
Okay.
is bandwidth a public utility, or
Yeah,
is
okay.
bandwidth to be owned? And the reason it should be a public utility and a common carrier is because, like water and power, it's a natural monopoly coming into your home or into your small business. And in America, there's strong corporate pressure to not make it a common carrier. And our federal communications code thus emerging financial control. So that the ability of the monetary abstraction to actually feed back and control the information system itself is how my dystopian future may come about. Michael Lewis has made a lot of bones in America recently with his book on high-frequency trading. So this is the ability of certain players to do basically arbitrage on financial transactions by being microseconds ahead, and front-running stock trades by being microseconds ahead of other competitors. And 40% of the American stock market right now is high-frequency trading. It's at least a skim taken right off the top. At worst, it's going to result in market instability and potentially just capture of the financial markets by the basically by the corporate bankers. Jaron Lanier has a book out right now making I think a very strong argument about the Francis and I at least go back to the glorious era when I'm sure many of us here remember this. Francis and I were more deeply engaged at that time in about maybe 95, 96, when there were these big arguments going around about how there shouldn't be any corporate interests on the internet. Like, what's happening with these creeping companies coming in, like putting, actually getting their own websites, and it's so silly looking back on that now when it's come to the point where the internet is the driver of the modern economy throughout the developed world. Lanier makes the observations about how government, not just corporate, but government players as well, are able to leverage vast computational power to drive their own financial interests and their own financial power. So for example, if you're Amazon and you know everything about everything that everybody's ever purchased, or if you're Facebook, you know about all their social interactions, or if you're Google, for God's sake, and so the best example he gives is machine translation, which actually isn't machine translation, it's just massive, so that when you crowdsource anything, you don't pay the people that you crowdsource. You crowdsource translation to everybody, and you learn statistically the patterns of how all these translations work. Well, all you're doing is exploiting these masses of people because you've got the big computers and you've got the big databases to do that without any compensation back to them. No micropayments come back to those people that are offering up their information freely into the system. They're able to exploit this. Or on the government side, if you're big government agencies like some of the kinds that I actually work with, you're able to amass these massive databases in a way that nobody else can. We had not, so the promise of the information dispersion that the internet offered is actually mirrored by the need to concentrate computational power in order to actually process the terabytes and petabytes of information that are coming off of these systems right now. And if you, in fact, some of my technical slides coming up will talk about these massive high-performance computing graph database engines that we're building at my lab that actually are necessary to handle information of that size and complexities. That's the big data revolution that's coming along as well. And then, of course, Piketty is in the news a lot on how the return on capital versus economic growth. A very simple observation, a kind of obvious observation if you just think about the mathematics of it. But what that means is that you get this hyper-exponential runaway growth of the abstraction that is the money. So once you have enough concentration of money in one place, it's able to exploit itself in a runaway positive feedback cycle. That's effectively what the thesis is behind that. And it's very obvious and simple if you cast it that way. That's right. That's right. If you're an economist, apparently it's confusing. I don't understand that. But,
They only work with linear models.
that's right. So that's what will stop the global brain from being just the information oligarchy. That's the challenge that I would lay down to this community. Okay, so that's great. So we're past the first hour, and that's wonderful. Thank you. I think it's an excellent point to take a breath and sort of think about what we want to do with the rest of our time. I know that you would have preferred like an hour talk, an hour discussion. We've been having a very healthy and robust discussion, which I appreciate. Seriously,
I actually prefer that you interrupted.
Good. I do too. Certainly for this kind of thing, this is perfect. I mean, it's just what is needed. This is more or less the first whole section because at this point I sort of joke. So what will stop the global brain from being just the information oligarchy? And then what is my work at Pacific Northwest National Lab have to do with any of this? And the answer is we're making it worse. No. No, but seriously, we are engaged in a collection of research activities that are at the cutting edge of some of these things that are going on, and that's what. So we're doing our best to sort of push this forward, and we're engaged in some of the. A good chunk of the fascinating little discussion we've been having here does not engage my everyday work or our sponsors in U.S. government or our collaborators in universities. But at the end of the day, when you think about it, it's all engaged. There's no way to avoid these kinds of discussions, and we are engaged at policy levels and at other levels as well. Yes.
And are you taking the opportunity as you are having the big computers and doing all this data gathering and analysis to put on the table to think of a solution for not reaching that situation? Between you?
I'm a working computer scientist. I'm a systems theorist, I'm a cybernetician, but to all outside appearances, I portray myself daily as a working computer scientist working in these kinds of areas. And I'm not going to tell you that me and my colleagues, and not just at Pacific Northwest National Lab, but all these professors that I work with and scientists and corporations, government agencies, it would be foolish to think that we sit around contemplating big questions and thinking about potential long-term solutions. That kind of thought leadership really does need to come from, honestly, the kind of community that Francis represents and the Global Brain Institute and related things like that. And we have a responsibility as technological practitioners to remain engaged. But if we wouldn't get our jobs done, we wouldn't have the time to do what we do if we spent our lives really at that level.
I mean, you have the capacities, you have all the tools to do that analysis as a job.
No, they have the technical tools, they don't have the conceptual tools.
Okay, well, but it's half of it.
Oh, sure. Well, let me be a little more responsive than that. The national labs are a fascinating place. Over the years, Francis has spent some time with us and got a feeling for this, and we've had colleagues come in and out in various ways. We sit at the sort of the confluence of the U.S. government, corporate research, and especially university research, and we're neither one or the other. There are actually, so for example, we are absolutely engaged in issues around policy and mitigation and related, these kinds of questions around things like cybercrime and cyber systems. A lot of our lab deals with things like nuclear policy and national security policy at that level. So it's actually not outside of our scope to be engaged in these levels. And I will take your challenge seriously. There is, it would not be inappropriate for our lab to start to get involved in that kind of science and policy discussions that would start to think about predicting where these technologies are going to lead society and how we need to respond to them. It's not our explicit mission, but it wouldn't be outside our mission.
It would be good when it will be a priority. But,
I don't know where it is a priority. Outside of a few think tanks like the Global Rain Institute and some other places, I don't really know where there's a concentration of powerful, interested people that are attending to these issues, which is why it's so important that those who are maintain a very high profile.
yeah.
No, it's true. It's true. And yeah, I mean, we're hurtling off a cliff, and I'm helping to pedal.
This is what religion is about, confession.
Sorry?
This is what religion is all about, confession.
I see.
That's the power.
So, so we should just continue on this way with the presentation and discussion intermixed, and then what I thought I would do is, we've got 45 minutes left in that model. What I would like to do is, I got this one piece of mathematics at the end that I'd like to lay out, and then I've got, hold on, oh, sorry, I'll go all the way up to the beginning. Right. I've got various sets of slides around massive semantic graph databases, descriptive semantic analysis, information theoretical cyber traffic analysis, and hybrid graph relational data structures. I want to just sort of cherry pick a couple of those based on the discussions that we've had over the past day. So for example, we were discussing with you, I think we were discussing reification patterns and semantic graphs. So let me just sort of move through and try to cherry pick a few select things and gauge interest. And then I'll close on this bit. Does that make sense? Do you have a question though? Somebody had a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to remark that there is a curious analogy between wealth, accumulation of wealth, distribution of wealth, and then computing power, accumulation of computing power,
Absolutely.
distribution of computing power. So perhaps we are not going anywhere, just the same system in a different...
We're all still people. And that's changed.
Which means...
No, I think there's an essential difference is that wealth has this kind of positive feedback. The more wealth you have, the easier it is to make more. While with information, you have diminishing returns. If you have 100 times as much data, you're not really 100 times as powerful. Usually, with approximate coarse data, you can do almost as much as with somewhat more precise, accurate data, but that take 100 times more computing power. So there is a decreasing returns in information control.
Maybe. So I do have a couple of overview slides also on the technical stuff, and that's maybe even sufficient for our discussion. I don't know. I sort of divided this into two missions. They're closely related, and it more or less reflects my funded portfolio at the moment. There's more that my lab does, but this is sort of my current activities. And the first is around large, complex graph-based data sets, which has been sort of implicit in some of these discussions, and we can make it a bit more explicit as well. And again, for this crowd especially, I wanted to, I make this argument a lot to my colleagues and my managers and stuff like that, and I usually get it across pretty well, and I think it reflects back well to me, but I think I think you guys understand it pretty quickly as well. So we all know the big data movement, right? Big data is everything, and we're climbing the hype curve on big data, and we're about to tumble over the top. A lot of government funding, U.S. government funding now behind big data in various ways. I assume the same is true over here. And one thing we recognize as a systems person, one thing that's easy to understand is that there's this distinction between different kinds of data. So it's one thing if I give you 1 trillion records. I've got a measurement coming off of a device, and pressure, temperature, and salinity, and I give you 1 trillion records. And there's all kinds of complex patterns and time-varying signals and all kinds of specialized stuff that I can do with that. So it's one thing to give you 1 trillion records of 3 data points, and it's an entirely different thing to give you 1 trillion different kinds of information. So pressure, temperature, salinity, height, weight, hair color, etc., in a heterogeneous collection. So when you're building this mathematical system of any type, again, go back to systems foundations, systems theory foundations, we keep track of 2 different kinds of things. There's our, in fact, sure, I can do it right here. I've got, to use database terms, if we think about data structures like rows and columns, the columns are the kinds of things I'm keeping track of, people, places, events, ages, as opposed to the facts that make up those tables. So I could have a zillion records of people living at places, but I'm only keeping track of 2 things. So big data we typically think of as the rows, the number of data points. Complex data is when we're talking about the number of columns. And you tend to get an exponential increase in data size as you increase the number of columns for the same amount of records that you're introducing. So one of our focus our focus at PNNL has been not just focus on big data, but on focus on complex data and big complex data. Big, not just big, but additionally heterogeneous types, irregular structures, and complex connectivity, where you're integrating databases from open source and with open world perspective, primarily graphical, but in combination with other database technologies, cloud technologies, key value stores, relational databases, etc. Looking for novel database solutions around relational and graph databases, and we're pursuing some foundational science and high-performance engineering, graph and hybrid languages, and knowledge discovery and multi-relational networks. These are the kinds of structures that you're going to need to process the data.govs and the kebabs and the kinds of massive data coming off of social networks. We say this is the kind of technology that is necessary for a global brain to be operational around the real data that it's collecting. So back to this, I just want to make this distinction. I think this might be an interesting point of discussion generally as to this distinction between relational and graph data and how that might play a role in these kind of global information technologies. Rows and columns, we're all familiar with that. Every Excel spreadsheet you build is basically one of these kinds of structures. In a graph database, it's sort of an alternative or converse paradigm where it's not rows and columns, it's nodes and edges. So the nodes are the basic items or facts, and then they're connected together by relations, these arrows. That was one of my analogy systems from the beginning was that, right? Where I said how entities, relations, and graph patterns are like types and tokens and types and schema. So the kind of information I'm talking about here lives in the schema. It's in bold, it's in the column headings. I'm talking about people, person, place, person, and age. The facts are in Roman, non-bold, Carol and Bob and Alice. Carol, Bob, and Alice, New York City, become nodes in the graph. And then the edges between the nodes are the relations that they are in. So the knows table, this table is who knows who, and that becomes an edge in the graph. This is, if you can trace it through, this graph is literally a representation of everything that's up in those tables. It's a one-to-one isomorphism. The schema information in the relational database is everything in bold. So the fact that the friend table maps people to people, the fact that the age table maps people to ages, is the schema, and that's held in what we call an ontology in the graph database. It's taken out into its own structure. It's also a graph structure. You've got the person node, the age, the edges here are the table names. So friend of is a relation from person to person. You just draw an edge from person back to itself and label that with friend of to indicate that that's that table. Person knows a person lives in a place, and a person has an age, and that's just an integer in that case. So the idea is that these graphical data models are better for certain kinds of information processing around when you want to look for patterns of connectivity, when you're dealing with sparse data that doesn't fill the tables. Just as a matter of computer science efficiency, it's better working on the big tables when they're densely populated, so if they're sparsely populated. And etc. Where you've got rich and random access structures, where you never know where you're going to be. You don't know who's connected to who.
Are there cases where relational data models are faster?
Oh, certainly. And in fact, if we get to that point, I can show you some things that we're doing in hybrid databases that combine the two together. The idea there is to optimize certain parts of the data for the graph side and certain parts for the relational side. So this is my first big area is in these technologies of graph databases. And related, closely related, is a mission that I'm working on around cyber in particular. So this is motivated, obviously, by cybersecurity work. That's where our funding comes from. But we're sort of taking up this challenge. I've been exposed to cyber issues for a long time. I'm a cybernetician, after all. And yes, they've stolen our phoneme, or actually we gave them the phoneme naturally. But I was singularly unimpressed over the years at how little actual good computer science or challenges for interesting theoretical developments are available from the cybersecurity. It was all whack-a-mole. You plug the hole, you list the vulnerability in a particular version of Unix or Windows, and sort of move on. So our lab has started an initiative recently sort of looking at the foundations of cyber representations and cyber analytics to understand what are the basic sort of modeling frameworks and mathematics that are available. So we're working there. And again, for this crowd, I think you'd appreciate this idea of developing formalism representing state and change of state in cyber systems, attending to their very specialized nature. Kind of like money is this ultimate abstraction, in a way, these cyber systems are a very special class of systems. First of all, they're engineered, so we can't use methods from discovery-based science. You can't bring physics and meteorology or whatever to bear, because we build these cyber systems as we choose. And secondly, they're digital. They're abstract, there's no space, there's, time is ordinal, there's no energy, there's no conservation laws, there's no natural metrics that you can bring to bear. And our state variables are not continuous physical measurements that are available for being modeled in like differential equations. So if you're trained in physics or electrical engineering or something, you're not going to be comfortable in this world. Our state variables are users, processes, and et cetera. So our goal is to build, again, drawing from my systems principles and my systems background, to be able to look at hierarchically organized discrete mathematical systems, where you're combining coarse-grained and fine-grained discrete math models together. Trying to build global modeling frameworks or languages for cyber systems. Our mathematical approaches, no, it's too quick. You should have seen that. Our mathematical approaches, so we know, just like the tables I was showing you before and the graphs, so this basic relationship between a tabular structure and a graphical structure in discrete mathematics and in mathematical systems theory, that's kind of the foundational structure. Every binary relation is a graph, and vice versa. Every graph is a binary relation, and that's sort of the foundation on which you build all discrete mathematics, and then it gets more complicated from there. So all discrete structures are reducible to these binary relations as directed graphs, but useful objects imply a host of additional structures. So higher order mathematical objects, we have labels and weights. You look at the symmetry, transitivity, and reflexivity properties of your graphs. You look at cycles, directed acyclic graphs, partial orders. And then you move on to even fancier things like hypergraphs and set graphs. It's like we were talking about the other day as a set graph, where you've got mappings from subsets, from sets to other sets. I call that a set graph, where you have n-ary edges, directed and undirected, and then you get into more complicated issues in combinatorics in particular, around set systems, partitions, covers, tensors, lattices, all these kinds of stuff, each with their own metrics interacting across scalar levels. So this is the vision for bringing this class of modeling methods to bear on cyber systems. And then, yes, you get to see the example from your group dealing with directed hypergraph models, a particular class of directed hypergraph models being brought to bear. In that context, then I like to show the pretty pictures. So here's a basic directed graph where we can identify our roots and our leaves and our strongly connected components. There's a wealth of things you can do. So just drawing something as a graph, representing some complex system as a graph, already allows you to do something with your analytics on it. But more than that, we want to add labels to everything, not just identifying the nodes, but actually attaching labels to the connections to be able to distinguish the semantic properties and how they actually relate to each other, to both the nodes and to the edges. Here's a simple model of a hypergraph. model where you're able to extend that to have multiple inputs and outputs on your edges. I've done a lot of work with these partial order or hierarchical structures over the years where you're attending to the transitivity properties in order to identify the levels that exist in your graph. This guy here is shown in levels, but those levels aren't always necessary. It depends on what the particular mathematical properties are. Hierarchical descriptions, of course, are one of the most foundational things that you can bring in systems theory. We talked about that already, like hierarchical levels of control. How do you know? We're talking about emergence. How do you identify when a system has emerged? It's because you have a hierarchical description. Because you have something that emits the descriptions in terms of levels. So being able to have a handle around the mathematics of hierarchy is absolutely essential for any of these kinds of discussions. And that brings in order theory and lattice theory and related things. Here's an example of a large hierarchy that you can actually bring metrics to bear on measuring, like how far apart are your levels, how far apart are your nodes that might be within one level versus between levels. What does it even mean to have multiple levels and how they interact with each other? All of that's available. What is that? Oh, that's that's too small. You can't even see that. So forget that. It's interesting. Okay. So like I say, I want to cherry pick a couple of things. Our big graph database is called GEMS, Graph Engine for Multi-Threaded Systems, and we're building that out. This is showing sort of the growth of the big data world. This is your singularity out here. No, not really. But as we go out into the later years, these are somewhat serious projections of. Notice this is in exabytes on the y-axis. Yottabytes, I think, is the next one, and I think that's the end. Right? Isn't there an end to the prefixes? I don't quite know. I had looked at that once, but it's threatening. The end is that you'll know when you hit the singularity when you go beyond yottabytes, right? That's the you're definitely there. But we're somewhere in here. 500 exabytes. This is global data. And the idea is that your relational database solutions are in this zone. Your other in the database what we call NoSQL solutions, which are avoiding actual SQL-based relational databases. And of course, we are optimistically putting our own GEMS platform well into this zone. It's got a complicated hierarchy of, we're building this out over commodity clusters. It's a high-performance graph engine to facilitate exactly the stuff that I was showing you before in terms of these big graph databases. Let me see where I want to take this next. This stuff is too boring.
Right.
You find some more interesting things. This will take too long. This is boring too. Oh, this is really boring. Anyway. Yeah, let's do this. This will put me about where I want to be. So this is where these two, remember I talked about these two big themes. One is graph databases in the context of relational databases, and the second is developing a sense of mathematical modeling over cyber systems. And where they come together is this work. We just had a paper accepted showing some of this stuff, so we're pretty proud of this. I fell into this stuff. I'm not a cyber guy, so it's weird. I've been a computer professional. I'm very proud of this. I've been a computer professional for 35 years. It's true, actually. I am proud of this. My first paid job, I'm showing my age. My first paid job, I was 14 years old in 1978. And my first paid job was working on TRS-80 Model 2s with a tape drive in the pre-PC days. And I was there to see the PCs come in, and we were working on all the old hardware all the way up through that. So I've been at this business a long time. This is also the point where you have the Dilbert joke. Okay? When I was your age, we didn't have ones, all we had was zeros. I'm here all night. Anyway, the point is that I've been a computer professional for all this time, and a systems guy, and a mathematical guy, and I've been a serious software developer. I started as a computer programmer back in that primordial era, and I worked my way through grad school as a developer, and I was managing large software projects at various points along the way. Once I got to grad school, I sort of fell away from that a bit. but I've never been a cyber guy. These guys are different. I mean, they live this world. So when I go into these meetings and I feel like these are subject matter experts and I'm some sort of strange theoretician. And I've been learning a ton about the way that the internet actually works. So around TCP/IP protocols and how traffic is analyzed. Let me give you a sense of what we're talking about here. So I was at a conference this year called FlowCon. FlowCon is about managing flow records. And a flow is a term used by Cisco back in the day to describe a particular kind of data structure like this. So you guys, I'm sure, recognize IP addresses, right? So everybody's got an IP address on their computer. You got dozens of those. There's 15 IPs just right in this room right now. And that's this dotted number address. And then you got a colon, and then you got a port. A lot of you, I mean, probably everybody's seen the IPs, probably a lot of you have seen the colon port thing as well. So that's the basic identification in the internet of where something is. That means that you're talking about, and colon 80 is web traffic. So all web traffic goes over colon 80. And this is an edge in a graph, so it's connected to another one. So 100.110.120.130 talks to 200.210.220.230, and it's going from port 80 to port 8080. And this might be a web page, or it might be something. And then attached to that, there's some additional information, number of packets. This is all packet switching, so you get a collection of packets to make up your email or your web page. The number of bytes in that collection of packets, the time scale that it's operating under, and then the protocol, in this case TCP. But it could be FTP or HTTP or all the different protocols that are out there that control the different kinds of web traffic that you've got. So this is a basic record of a basic transaction of the global brain, if you will, right? This is like one neuron talking to one other neuron, and what it's done over a particular period of time from time 2 to time 5. They build things they call sensors, and so you stick a sensor on a computer, and it's basically a program. But it runs and it monitors everything coming out of this port, or out of this computer rather, from this IP address downstream to the next guy down. All your routers, so you've got a router in your home probably, most of you, and there's big routers over in the computer center that direct the traffic from here to here. They all record this information as well as they can. A lot of times they sample it and it's not all available. As you'll see in a moment, these things get enormous. So these are massive graphs of internet traffic. That's what they are. Source IP, destination IP port with additional information. These are used for all kinds of things, to identify, categorize, and mitigate attacks, to diagnose number of problems, and for wide area situational awareness. Just to give you a sense of the size of these things. So we're talking about one of these sensors on one PNNL machine for a period of 1 day. And they were able to measure 613 million flows. Across our entire enterprise, it's many billions of flows per day. And I'm talking about, not talking about packets, I'm talking about flows. Now, we're a big lab, we're a big computer lab, but you can just get a sense of scale. 500 million flows, 27 billion packets, and 24 terabytes. And so I put the standard deviations up here because sometimes those are significant. So for example, the number of packets per flow, extraordinarily high standard deviation relative to the mean, which means that it's widely varying how many packets per flow you might have. And same thing for bytes per flow. So that's just to give you a sense of how large these graphs get. This slide was built to motivate the use of our massive graph database for managing these kinds, for analyzing these kinds of graphs. This is just some of the test data sets that we've got access to. I'll jump ahead. When you want to look at some of the attack patterns that are on the internet, they admit to descriptions in terms of these kinds of graph structures. So here's your botnet attack. What characterizes a botnet attack is you've got 3 kinds of machines. You've got controllers. These are the actual criminals that are carrying out the botnet. They infect then these bot machines. I'm sure many of your machines are bots and you don't even know it. You're infected as zombies, and then those zombie bot machines turn around and attack target machines. And what characterizes this graph pattern is you've got a large collection of bi-directional flows from the bots to the controllers with an average size, S, relatively small, and a very small number of controllers relative to the number of bots. Similarly, a small number of targets relative to the number of bots, but it's a one-directional flow with a very large size. So this is a complex graph pattern. If we can bring our big graph database to bear against this, we'll be able to detect these kinds of patterns for this one particular kind of attack. There's a watering hole attack. Watering hole attack is like we've got a website for like a newspaper or TV, or some kind of public website, and it actually has some malware on it. That's the bait machine. The bait machine talks to the, notice two-directional normal flows over a long period of time to these target machines. And then, so that's from time t1 to 100. And then all of a sudden at time 110, they all turn around together at the same time and start talking to their controller machine. So that's a time-based pattern that you're looking at. They were infected by the bait, and then all of a sudden they report back up to their controller because they were infected with the malware. So another complex pattern that we're going to use. So notice what's significant about this is that, so I was talking about graph-based data. There's a graph pattern here for sure, but it's not purely a graph pattern. There's other quantitative information here as well. We're talking about average size being small, average size being large. We're talking about time scales and whether they match up with each other. So it's actually a mixture of graph-based data and quantitative data at the same time. So we're using this to motivate to your question about how you can mix together graph-based technology and relational-based technology in service of this kind of stuff. This is a sample data set we're working with 69 million flows. That's considered a medium-sized example. And I'll just jump ahead to show a couple of the things. So in our 69 million flows, this is a log-log scale of the number of flows coming in and the number of flows going out for certain IP addresses. And we're able to see, it took me a long time to get my head around this. So here's your vertical axis, diagonal axis, right? So everything below this line has more coming in than going out. And everything above this line has more going out than coming in. And in our test example, we're seeing these points over here. This is a log-log scale, so every unit this way is an order of magnitude change. So you can see there are these vast number of flows coming into these small number of machines. These are actually web servers. That's what they are within this test sample. And so the question is, why, it's a web server, why wouldn't it have a lot of outgoing flows instead of a lot of incoming flows? Why is it on the other side of the diagonal? And it took me a long time to learn this. So actually what happens is, if you go to NewYorkTimes.com and request something from that, because it's coming from you to it, the flow from that point forward is always coming as if you're coming to it. Right? You're making the request to it. Therefore, all subsequent data coming from that is still recorded as if it's coming from you to it. That's the flow direction. So it was initiated from you, therefore it's still coming to you. So in fact, all web servers have this structure. Okay, fine. Then what about all this stuff up here? What about those blue guys that are on the other side of the diagonal? They have a lot more outgoing flows. What are they? In fact, in this test data, those are all of our attackers. This is a test scenario involving denial of service attacks and botnet attacks and other sorts of things. So we're able to pick that out very quickly and able to see what's going on there. And that's pretty cool.
But you see only this flow in real life when there is an attack, so it's not, can you do prevention with this? You will see this happening during the attack, but wouldn't it be too late?
Maybe. It depends. Depends how long the attack lasts. And by itself, that's not so tremendously important. The fact that, I'm sorry. What I mean is, what we're trying to bring to the table here, so people do traffic analysis all the time now, but they don't use a graph-based formalism because they haven't had the tools to do it, right? We're now building the tools that they need in order to be able to bring graph analysis to these monster traffic things. So in the past, they wouldn't be able to get this clear diagnostic information, but it's not like they didn't know. So we're simply, that particular plot is simply used as an example of where our graph-based technology is able to identify these features. It's not that you need it in order to see you've got a lot of flows. So I'm more illustrating the problem using a graph theoretical approach than anything else. In practice, they see when they're, in practice, it's not a mystery to anybody when you're under a denial of service attack, right? You know it, and everybody does know it. So the question isn't identifying denial of service. I put it out there because that's what I'm. Now this, on the other hand, maybe more so. What I'm showing here is, on the x-axis, first of all, this is a movie, and it's operating over a period of days, so each chunk is a day. These are all IPs, On my x-axis is the payload going out, and on my y-axis is the number of edges, the number of flows that are going out. And the important thing here is actually the size of the dot. My little dots have small payload, my big dots have large payload coming in. And of course, what are you seeing over here? You're seeing that one big dot floating along on days, whatever it is. Here it comes, wait for it to come around again. There. So April 3rd, 4, 5, 6. That's a single IP. It's a single IP that's outside of my network. It's in the external world. And it's got a vastly large incoming payload. That is an exfiltration event. That is a situation where somebody inside my enterprise was infected and started dumping a massive data out to that one target machine outside. And this is a test data set, like I'm saying. So it was recorded in the document describing the data set that this exfiltration event was occurring, but we didn't know it at the time. And just through these methods, you're able, I mean, it's clear as day if you look at it like this. But being able to do this kind of graph-based traffic analysis is not a capability that's out there right now. Or it is, but it's in a very small community.
If you can identify the machine to which it's directed, can you find out who was behind that machine?
Depends. Since this is a test data set, we knew exactly what it was. Here's another fun one. This is summarizing a week's worth of data. On your y-axis is your IPs. So the green dots are my internal ones. These are my servers and my workstations inside my enterprise. My blue dots is the rest of the internet outside, the ones that we're simulating in this test data. And this is summarizing a week's worth of data. On the x-axis is the port that's being used. So if you know about computers, you know there's 65,000 ports, and each port does a different thing. So we said port 80 was for web traffic, port 25 is for email, that kind of thing. Each port is used for a different purpose. And these high ports in the tens of thousands, 50,000s, those can be used, processes can just grab them and use them for certain things. So we color a dot in if that port was used by a particular IP. So this green dot here means that this IP used that port over the course of the week. And so you can see that my external guys are using all of my ports because they're attacking. They're using port scans, or they're using other kinds of methods to come in and try to infiltrate my machines. And my green one's not so much. So in the simulation, in the scenario that we're dealing with here, we've got a series of attacks going on, and the simulation was built as if this was a naive company. In this case, they didn't know what they were doing, and they were simply wide open to these kinds of attacks. So it's really funny. In the simulation, they shut down for the weekend. They pulled the plug. We're under attack. They pull the plug, and they install an intrusion detection system. And they stand themselves back up the next week, and then this is the pattern that you see for the next week. So demonstrating how successful the intrusion detection system was, virtually nobody's coming in on the external ports. Certainly no port scanning is going on, and even inside it's much cleaner as well. So that's a pretty picture to show. I'm going to move on. Uh, 15 minutes. I'll show.
You can go over the time if necessary.
Well, I wouldn't subject you all to that. I'll. So a point that's come up with Victorus, and I think might be of general interest to people as well. I'll just finish with two things. This thing, and then my final thing on the topology. So, one of the reasons, so we do this graph-based traffic analysis on cyber is valuable for a number of reasons for us. So obviously one reason is because a lot of our sponsors really care about this, right? I mean, being able to do this kind of technology around this graph-based traffic analysis is crucial for good chunks of the US government and some of the people that we work for at P&L. Additionally, it's a really good problem to drive these big graphs. It's obviously a killer problem in terms of world significance now, being able to manage all this cyber traffic. But at a strictly technological level, it's good because, as we were describing, it kind of motivates a hybrid problem. It's not a pure graph problem. There's other things that are attendant to it. So in that sense, NetFlow sort of exemplifies a challenge to the current batch of graph-based database technologies, for which Sparkle is the query language. Again, some of you probably know some of this. So let's look at, here is an example of my NetFlow graph that we've been talking about. Here, just for convenience, I've abstracted a little bit, so it's not like 110.something, it's just a.x. So pretend that's your IP address. Just 2 octets, a.x. And then :1, port 1, right? :3, port 3, :1 again, port 1. So I got a.x1 talking to b.x3 with 1 byte of data, that's flow number 1 with 33 bytes from time interval 2 to 5, here's time interval 4 to 4, etc. And then I say this is my external site, E, here's my internal site, I. So I got 2 outside IPs talking to an inside IP, and this is the structure I have. This is the graph that I care about, and I want to build out graphs like this with millions, billions, maybe trillions of edges. And that's the basic structure that we're working with. But if you, you'll notice that from a perspective of a pure graph, we've actually got a rich set of information on each node and a rich set of information on each edge. Mathematically, we've got a vector of attributes sitting on the edge and a vector of attributes sitting on each node. So that's a challenge to the pure graph systems to be able to represent all that rich metadata. One way to go about this is what we call starification. It's a silly name for what's called by one cicada the direct mapping. And basically what you do then is you take each of my flow edges, it's like a row in a database, and so you represent each record in your database as a little star pattern. So you make a node for flow 1, actually labeling the row itself. Row 1 versus row 2. So here's row 1, and you hang off all of the attributes as edges along that. So the source IP, destination IP, etc., all of that. And so if I've got 2 flow records, I have to have 2 stars, and then I recognize the fact that the destination IP here is the same as the source IP here. I should have included the table here. So this, where is it? Sorry. Right. A.x is talking to B.x, and
No, it's not that.
The left IP plus left port.
yeah, it doesn't match. It just doesn't match my diagram precisely. Well, it's showing a different direction, that's all. It's not showing a through link, it's showing a 2 links. So I should have done the example better, but you get the idea. The fact that you match the IP, in case it's actually destination, not source of destination. It's the same concept. So the point is that you happen to recognize that 2 of the IPs are the same, and then you just draw an edge between those 2. So this is in starification strategies to moving from relational to graph data, that's what you do. You create each record as a star and then link the stars together through their attributes. So if you bring that to what we call full reification, from starification to reification, in a pure graph system, you have to take these 2 edges with their complex attributes, turn into actually ridiculously large number of edges in a full reified graph. So I've got a node here for edge 1, a node for edge 2, but I also have nodes for each of the nodes, and I hang all their information off each one and link them all up. What you end up, when you turn this complex object, which is a graph edge with a lot of metadata, you end up exploding the number of actual edges you need in your RDF graph. This is a serious issue. So this is a problem with pure graph languages in this way. What we're moving towards, is to start to move to hybrid systems, where you're able to distinguish between that part of your data which really forms the core graph structure. Remember, in fact, let's just look at it for a minute this way. My real graph, the graph that I actually want to find a graph pattern in, is up here. It's got 3 nodes and 2 edges. Down here, that's like node 1, node 2, node 3, and then edge 1 and edge 2. Those are the things that I actually care about in terms of doing graph traversals. So the idea is to make a simplified form where I simply strip off the graphy part, and then all the rest of that metadata gets thrown into a traditional relational database, table-based, for that stuff. So for this talk, I think I'll just leave it there, to say that's where our motivation is moving. The rest of these slides discuss some of the technical details of how we would do that. Let's see if there's some good pictures here that would show that. No, not really. And then I'm making some mathematical observations here. Well, actually, this might work. Here you go. This will do. So this is my full reified graph up here. My URIs in RDF, in the language that's actually used to represent this stuff, a URI is like a URL for your web browser, right? It's a universal resource identifier. There you go. And so the real part of my graph is the connections between my URIs shown in black. But in red and green are the attributes that really sit on the nodes as a vector of attributes. That's the stuff that I want to shunt off to the relational side of my hybrid. So really, my graph looks like this, a collection of URIs with A and X and C and Y all sort of sitting up on top as a collection of attributes. So here's my hybrid structure where I have a graph showing just the connections between the graphy part, and then all of my additional attributes are thrown over here in my relational table. So that's obviously a cartoonish view, but this is the direction that we're going with our big GEMS platform that's scaling up at these levels. There's some interesting theoretical things here. Basically what you do is you need to create a schema graph that shows how all of your relations are connected to each other. You find the cyclic parts, and it's the cyclic parts that actually support the graph structure. Anything that's not part of the cycle is necessarily in the hybrid side. So if anybody cares more, I can go on about that in more depth. Okay. I'll close out then on this one last thing that I said I wanted to talk about. So, how to motivate this? So, technically I'm a mathematical systems theorist, and it's really strange because I get to tell you all my jokes. My other joke is, I already told you the Dilbert joke. My other joke is when I'm introducing myself to people, I say, Francis knows the truth, right? That I'm a systems theorist and a cybernetician. But to a lot of people, I say, I call myself a mathematician as long as I'm the only one in the room doing so. Which is frequently the case. In fact, any mathematicians here? I say that. Aha! All right, so I'm not a mathematician. But seriously, what this means is, as a mathematical systems theorist, it's weird because, so to a computer scientist, I'm very mathy. To a mathematician, I'm worse than applied. Because to be an applied mathematician, are you applied or a pure mathematician?
Well, I did pure mathematics.
Sorry?
I did pure mathematics.
Okay, so then you know that there's nothing worse than an applied mathematician. So, I'm even worse than that. So I'm a mathematical systems theorist. So what that really means is that I use mathematics as a modeling language. I use mathematical structures and techniques to describe systems and to describe models of systems and how models interact with each other. So I'm proud of having what they call famously mathematical maturity. I'm able to read a lot of stuff. I can do the occasional theorem, but I work with serious mathematicians who prove my theorems for me. I'm good at conjectures. I'm the conjecture guy. And in a way, there's an advantage to this because, at risk of offending you, real mathematicians are motivated. So, applied mathematicians are motivated by the problems they're trying to solve. Real mathematicians, pure mathematicians, are motivated strictly by the aesthetics of the mathematical problem. I hope you wouldn't disagree with that. I don't have either of those motivations. I have them, but my real motivation is to be able to construct elegant models of systems. That's really what I care about doing. And I use mathematics to do that, but I can use other things as well. I can use language, I can do philosophical work, I can do diagrams, I can do code. There's a lot of things that you can bring to bear there. But I look for the simplest kinds of mathematical descriptions I can. I prefer to work in mathematical foundations when I can. And over the years, that's led me in a bunch of different directions. So I began working with fundamental uncertainty structures and working with set systems and lattices and a bunch of some kind of core things like that. And it's funny because my math degree, I sort of backed into my math degree as an undergrad. I'm just at that era, or just at that generation. There was no computer science department. It was too new. Computer science hadn't existed long enough to have a computer science department in my college. So I took all the computer classes that were all offered in the math department, and I ended up with a math degree, and that's like nice. So in that sense, I can call myself a mathematician. But like, you know, I looked at my C+ in real analysis and said, this is maybe not the course that I should be on, and abandoned that. And I look back now and I realize that I did myself a disservice. You know, damn, I should have taken topology, right? And so over the years, as I started to do, and I've tried to work more seriously as a mathematician in recent years, I've fallen back into a part of discrete topology that I think is extremely interesting from this perspective of mathematical systems theory, how you build fundamental models of systems using some basic discrete math kinds of concepts. So I just want to show, I've got a couple of slides here to sort of illustrate where we're taking some new work. And I just want to use that as a way to describe how some of this stuff can be used for systems descriptions. So the motivation here is some work. Actually, I'm very pleased to say we just landed this project. So this is going to be a DARPA project. Relatively small level at the beginning. We're working with DARPA to sort of build out a larger project in this area. I assume you all know DARPA. That's the Defense Agency funder, does a lot of cool basic science in the United States. So if you've got a situation where a demonstration, a public event, or an incident, you've got a bunch of sensors, or multiple analytics. We use analytics as a term to describe like, oh, I got a computer program which does some analysis and finds some feature. And so it's a computer program that spits out some answers to something, or it takes in some sensor feed and it gives you some set of features off of it. So that's what we call it analytics. So I got a collection of these analytics and around a public event, like maybe Twitter feeds, news reports, YouTube broadcasts, structured data, etc. Maybe they come with geocodes, time codes, or group size. And I want to get some situational awareness of that event in more or less real time. And I'm talking like some public demonstration or something like that. So on the mall in DC, right? A bunch of people come out. Now, some of our sensors return semantic information in the sense of being produced from computational linguistics or keywords, maybe OCR, optical character recognition of signs that are in the YouTubes or something like that. Feature detections or other kinds of metadata. Keywords, topics, handles, hashtags, proper nouns. Our sponsor cares a lot about sentiment and polarity. So, for example, you're able to say, these guys are pro, these guys are against. These guys are really intense, these guys are not so intense, that kind of thing. That's polarity intensity. And then there's a bunch of things also to do with uncertainty quantification around that. So the idea is to build a unified semantic model, which is a data model or an ontology around a set of things. So we've got our who, where, how many, maybe the topic, maybe the sentiment, maybe the intensity. That's sort of the data frame, the ontology into which all of this information will be gathered. So we've got this frame-based event template. I've got sensor 1 and sensor 2, and they read off different things. These sensors, these analytics, right? They produce different information about different things. This guy saying there's a demonstration going on in the plaza, there's 45 people, they care about abortion, and their intensity is high. This next sensor says, well, it's Joe. Joe's there. No, in addition to Joe, there's like 22 other people, and it's about women's health. It's not about abortion, it's about women's health, and they're angry, but the intensity is low, that kind of thing. And how do I combine these together to form a common situational picture about this? So we fill in Joe from here and Plaza from there, etc. And maybe you average the crowd estimates together, but you want to do a weighted average, something along those lines. So the challenges are, so we want to integrate multiple sensors, fill the slots with optimal values, aggregate uncertainty, how to integrate where the coverage overlaps, how to measure inconsistency, and how to target sensors to enhance, to ensure consistency. And what we're bringing to the table about that, move on. What we're bringing to the table about that is this really cool idea that's really hot in the data science community right now around what's called persistent homology. And this is a nice little cartoon that shows basically how we're doing this. This was our point of discussion from dinner last night as we closed about how you can identify graph structures over a course of time. With this changing graph structure, how you identify features in a changing graph structure over time. So this is a concrete example. Each of the points up here is representing a radar tower. So I've got a big field, or a big area, and I got a bunch of radar towers around that. And radio towers. And so the radio towers have to be able to hear each other. Each one has a range. If the ranges overlap, that means you can send a message from one radio tower to the other, right? So what you can do is you can build a model and you say, at this level of intensity, I get a certain radius around each radio tower. And as I turn the power up, then the radius grows. And grows and grows and grows until right here is a whole lot of overlap. Here is a little overlap, here is an awful lot of overlap. Every time that two of these circles intersect, I can draw an edge between them here in this graph. So I construct a graph representation of the overlap. And so an edge in this graph represents an overlap between two radio towers at a certain level of intensity. And that's great for pairwise overlap. But what about three-way overlap? In this case up here, I've got these three which overlap jointly. And so when I've got three overlapping jointly, I want to draw a triangle. So that's showing a three-way interaction between those. And so I end up with this structure, and this structure represents the entire overlap structure of that level of coverage. And as I increase the coverage, notice I have a monotonic increase of the power, which means that I can only get closer together, which means the overlaps can only increase. So everything that's present in this graph is also present in this graph, but more. So the graph gets bigger and bigger, and in particular I get more triangles than I had before. Here comes a triangle that wasn't there before. And now I got this little guy with four. It's representing a four-way connection between my four radio towers. And so I color that in a different color. That's actually a tetrahedron, is what that is. It's not a triangle, it's a tetrahedron. Because it's representing a 4 points interacting in a three-dimensional structure. Ooh, look, I get to use chalk. So I'm going to do this to distinguish something. So here I've got a point connected to another point with an edge. Here's another edge, here's another edge. These are three edges, but this is not what I'm shading in this triangle to indicate that it's actually the triangle itself as a two-dimensional object, which is distinguished from these three edges, which is just three edges connected to each other. So we represent the point as a zero-dimensional object, an edge is a one-dimensional object, and this face is a two-dimensional object, and yes, you can keep going. This guy here is a three-dimensional object. It's an actual tetrahedron.
So it means that it's an overlap of the three fields on the same spot.
Yes. No, four. Not three, four. When I've got these four radio towers around this green thing.
I was speaking about the triangle.
Oh yes, the triangle is three, that's right. So this is a solid. And in fact, from basic geometry, you know that I can have a cube. A cube is a three-dimensional object which has 6 two-dimensional faces and 8 one-dimensional edges. 12 one-dimensional edges and 8 zero-dimensional points. And in fact, it's an object that's constructed by gluing together my 0, 1, 2, and 2-dimensional objects together in a particular way to form that one three-dimensional object. And that's what I'm building up here. As this increases, I get, here's a three-dimensional object. Well, if I have a six-way interaction, I represent that as a six-dimensional composition of all of those things. So that's fine, that's great. But notice that, look at this little hexagon here. He's here, he's here, he's here. Here he gets filled in by a bunch of triangles. Here he gets filled in by a purple guy as it gets more and more. This structure is present in the earlier version, and it's also present in the later ones as well. This is a persistent structure, and it's a way for those radio towers to communicate to each other around the loop. And it's present throughout. So that's why it's called persistent homology. Persistent means that over this range of parameters, I'm seeing that feature. Homology means it's the same shape, which means it's the same shape structure that's present all the time. So these techniques are used, this is an application of algebraic topology to sensor integration, and it's really out there. It's really growing in popularity. It's really high-powered stuff. It's very deep mathematics, kind of mathematics that I don't normally do, right? I'm a simple guy, I'm a discrete math guy. Have you been exposed to this kind of stuff?
I heard a paper for it.
Okay, so you're vouching for me when I said it's actually, it's cool. So persistent topology, it defines these topological holes for identifying consistency and connectivity. What is the connectivity pattern amongst us? What's the overlap? Now, my attraction to this is because, as a basic idea, this thing is called a simplicial complex. That's what these structures are called. It's this, so a cube is a simplicial complex because it's a way to glue together 0, 1, and 2-dimensional structures to form a 3-dimensional object. Well, there's other ways that you can glue together different objects of different dimensional structure to create really interesting representations. So going back to mathematical systems theory as a way to build mathematical representations of complex systems, I think these are tremendously valuable. They give you just what you need to represent multi-way interactions. So for example, if you're doing data analysis and I've got 10 variables, and normally what you do an ANOVA, and you figure out what's the linear dependence, is any one variable dependent on another variable? And you try to find, if you're doing factor analysis, if you're doing social sciences, and you want to control for certain parameters and look at just the dependency there among others. So finding pairwise dependency is easy. If you go to 3-way dependency, 4-way dependency, you tend to not be able to do that, you leave them out. These structures are ways to represent what my multi-way dependencies are within any particular structure. Every 4-way dependency gets modeled as a tetrahedron, a 3-way dependency as a triangle.
You should talk to Jeffrey Johnson.
Yeah. I saw from the table of contents. I saw. Okay. So what does all this have to do with my problem? Remember, we're doing recognition of situation awareness for events. All right. So the basic idea is this. This kind of stuff gives you representations of the dependency structure amongst our sensors. So we're talking about sensors, right? Just like our radar towers are like sensors, our sensors are these analytic feeds that are coming off of these Twitters and stuff. And this measures the structural overlap between them. What does it mean to have structural overlap between semantic sensors? That means I got a Twitter feed where, remember we said, this guy says they're talking about abortion, this guy says they're talking about women's rights. That means there's an overlap between what they're talking. They're both talking about topics, so I want to represent that as an edge in my graph because they're talking about the same thing. They're not talking about the same way. There's a distance between the values, but they're talking about the same thing, so I would draw an edge there. If I've got 3 sensors that are all talking about crowd size, then I would draw a triangle to represent the 3-way connections between crowd size, even if they're reading off in different things. So the simplicial complexes are great for representing the structural relations between my sensor feeds, but they don't talk about the data itself. I need more to talk about the data itself, and that's where we're using this stuff that this colleague of mine, this is Michael Robinson's work out of American University, adding in sheaves to represent the data themselves. So now we add the data to the connectivity information, we give knowledge of each sensor individually, add knowledge of local interaction networks, we can automatically generate an integrated sensor over this structural framework. That's what we're trying to do. Let me give you, I like to give a real example. This guy's a real electrical, he deals with like radar and stuff that I don't do. He does like signal filtering and signal interaction and all this kind of stuff. So, our requirement is that we want to have we have to have this interaction network amongst our semantic sensors. So here's a little test problem we're using to represent this, right? At a high school, it's an American context, Macateer European context. At a high school, undergrad, grad, and postdoc. I assume that makes sense to you guys, right? So I got in high school, I've got X is my high school GPA, my grade point average, and I get a certain grade in high school with it's X. I get a certain grade in undergrad, and that's a Y. When I get to my grad school, I got a stipend. They give me a little money for my grad research, and that's S. I've left off, unfortunately, I need to draw the picture. There should be a Z up here too. So imagine there's also a Z up here, which is the graduate GPA. That's how well I did in grad school. And then finally, I move on to my first postdoc position. Very proud of myself. I get an actual salary, which is A. Now, so we begin with that. So that's the information that each one of these owns by itself. But there's also transmission amongst them. In particular, the high school sends the GPA on to the undergrad, and the undergrad sends its GPA up to the grad school and to the postdoc, and then the grad school sends its GPA on to the postdoc. But the salary information and the stipend information obviously is private to each of those institutions, so they hold on to them themselves. Okay? So this is the information flow over time. Remember, Francis, I said I get a static description? Because what you do is you end up with a static, the fact that since some items are sent downstream, once they equilibrate at the end of that process, then you end up with your final information sharing picture, statically. So my high school just knows its GPA, but the grad school knows the undergrad GPA and the grad GPA and the salary, stipend, and a stipend. So certain of these groups know certain things and others know others. Right? Is that clear so far? Okay. So what do we do with that? Well, first of all, we represent the structure as a simplicial complex. And in fact, this is the simplicial complex right there. So I've got an edge between the high school and the undergrad, but I got this triangle between undergrad, grad, and postdoc because they all share the undergrad GPA. So that one piece of information is shared in common between the three of them. So I got a two-dimensional structure, and so I got one two-dimensional structure, I got 1, 2, 3, 4 one-dimensional structures, and I got 1, 2, 3, 4 zero-dimensional structures. So I glued together those pieces of information. And you represent that, so what did I say? I said I've got 1, 3, 1, 3, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 ones, so that's 4 total, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 zeros, so that's, what about 2? 9. 9 total objects I need to keep track of. 4 zero-dimensional, 4 one-dimensional, and 1 two-dimensional. There's 9 things I got to keep track of, and that's what this diagram is showing here. All 9 of those of different dimensionalities. So this is one of my zeros, this is just the high school, this is just the undergrad, and this guy sitting between them is the interaction between the high school and the undergrad. That's the one-dimensional object. So this guy is showing just the GPA for the undergrad, for the high school rather, going back and forth between them. They share that. So this is a one-dimensional object, that's a one-dimensional, and this guy here sitting in the center, that's my three-way interaction. That's the triangle. So I got all 9 of them here, and on each 9, I also get a vector of points. Right? That's what the sheaf actually does for you. So the basic structure is this, but then on top of that, I got the fact that I got one piece of information here, I got one piece of information here, I got actually 2 pieces of information sitting on that point, I've got 3 pieces of information sitting on that point, and I've got 3 pieces of information sitting on that point, and then to fill it out, 2 here, 1 here, 1 here, and then 1 actually on the triangle itself. Notice that the dimension below this, I could write the dimensionality of the structure. That's a 0, that's a 0, that's a 0, that's a 0, that's a 1, 1, 1, 1, and then finally a 2 there. So the dimensionality of the structure is independent of the dimensionality of the information that I can put on the structure. Does that make sense? That's a very powerful set of techniques that allows you to represent the interactions and the valence of each of the points in that information flow independently of each other. And then furthermore, there's a bunch of things you can draw. So there are theorems out of this persistent homology work that says something like, all the error propagation, tracking, and checking methods that you want to do in these kinds of structures will emulate this formalism. And that's a theorem. So, the rest of that is just for that. This is the basic idea. So the question is, so sitting here with this, let me just really close out with this one last thought then. What does any of this have to do with any of this other stuff we were talking about earlier in the afternoon? And for the mathematically inclined out there, we can unpack that a little more in depth. For right now, let me just say that when you're attendant to these sort of basic mathematical structures that come from mathematical systems theory that really underpin certainly the approach that Francis and I have taken over the years to mathematical modeling, like your hypergraph model currently, but all the others. I'm hopeful that this class of techniques around these simplicial complex type structures and these ideas from topology are of that scale and of that scope. So basic relational structures, basic graph theoretical structures, and this are in the same universe. I know you had your colleague Johnson, he actually came here, is that right?
Yeah.
So maybe some of you were present.
Tried to convince us just like you that this was very fundamental and that we should start
so
doing this, but we were not convinced.
and maybe you're still not convinced.
No.
So for those who care specific about this mathematical topic, we could take some time because I actually think I might be able to do some convincing along those lines. And it's, and remember the slide that I had, somewhere in the middle, I had this slide showing all these different graphs and stuff running around. So it was like with the ordered structures and the label graphs and hypergraphs and all that. So this stuff lives in that collection. If you attend to these discrete math structures, like hypergraphs as an example, or set systems, or things like that, this fits in that universe. Simplicial complexes, finite topologies, set systems, hypergraphs, set graphs, directed graphs are in the same universe of complexity around the kinds of mathematical structures that we should be bringing to bear on our modeling. Personally, I'm excited. The reason I'm excited about this stuff is because I didn't know. I knew about the rest of them, but I did not know about these until rather recently. It's filling a hole for me that I didn't know I had. I'd been sort of exposed to this work about 10 years ago, but I didn't have enough sophistication at the time to appreciate what I was seeing.
I'm sure Jeffrey Joslyn will be very enthusiastic to fill your hole. Just don't.
Very good, very good. Well, I really appreciate everybody paying attention. Thank you very much. Like I say, it was a trip. Getting back here after all these years and spending some good time with you. I hope you're entertained, if not more. Thank you.
Still some chance to ask questions if you want. You don't have to leave here. So.
Just a question about topology. Have you explored methods which use fractal geometries because a lot of these networks have different structures that are fractal?
It's a good question. Let me think. So I've certainly read, so in my education as a systems theorist, I read, especially being educated at the time that I was, which was the late 80s into the early 90s, I read heavily in dynamic systems theory, fractal geometry, and self-organizing systems and all that kind of stuff. And so I have a deep appreciation for that stuff. What role that would play in this kind of modeling is less clear to me because, so one thing that I've tried to do is focus more on discrete mathematics and discrete mathematical structures. And I think fractal geometry in particular requires a continuous view. So, for example, what it does is it in particular provides a continuous representation of dimension. The idea that you could have a 2.5 or 2.63 dimensional structure, right? That's basically what they're doing. I have no idea how that could interact with this world. It's an interesting thought as to whether it might or whether it might not. In other words, here I've been talking about gluing together these integer dimension structures. If I had a 1.5 dimensional structure somewhere in here, what would that even mean? So the answer is no, I've not thought about this. Thank you.
You can also question in what dimension the structure now is.
Oh, that one there. Yeah, no, that's a good point.
So maybe there the fractal theory can
well,
be of any use.
The simplest way is, well, actually, I have an answer. That is a two-dimensional structure. And that's a two-dimensional structure for the same reason that the cube is a three-dimensional structure. You basically have to take the max dimension present in the simplicial complex. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense, and you wouldn't be able to motivate the cube to be a three-dimensional structure. We know it is. We know the cube is a three-dimensional structure. So this had better be a two-dimensional structure, or we're all in trouble.
Cube has a one and a two-dimensional structure attached to it that are not
Then it's
part of the
then it's a complex.
There you go.
Well,
it's
okay, no, okay.
But did I understand it well that a sheaf is a simplicial complex with numbers attached to it?
Yes.
Because I've always wondered what a sheaf was.
There you go.
I've seen the title sheaves and cohomologies, and I've always wondered what that was.
Yeah, that's basically it. What I'm showing you there is a sheaf. The red numbers are the dimension of the structure, and the white numbers are the dimension of the data attached to that object. Yeah, I'm just reading in, so sheaf cohomology is the term of art that's used to describe data inconsistencies and to build a global data view. And I'm just at that point of the book where I'm learning about like sheaf morphisms. So sheaf morphism is a category theoretical way to make mappings between sheaves. And you want to make mappings between sheaves on the same structure. So I got a structure of sensors, but I get one data report at one time and another data report at another time because I need to make a mapping from one set of data values to the other that occur at different times over the same sheaf. So that's called a sheaf morphism, and there's a category of sheaves, and the morphisms within that category. So that's fun.
Another problem I have with this kind of representation is that it's a purely discrete representation. Either it's there or it's not there,
Yes.
while data are typically noisy.
I got to answer that then. I got an answer. Here you go. Remember, what we talked about, okay. So far what I've got here is a sheaf. I built you a sheaf, right? But what about that slide with the radars on it? The slide with the radars was talking about persistent homology. That was saying that you vary a parameter and then the intersections grow and then you can identify that cyclic structure that persisted across a range of that parameter, right? Well, what does that have to do with this? Necessarily anything. Well, I haven't told you the rest of the story. I quit. Maybe I shouldn't have. So, this is just one kind of sheaf. The work we're proposing to do for DARPA, that we think has been accepted for DARPA, says, let's not just build one sheaf, so the concept is to parameterize a network of sensors based on quantitative and qualitative analysis in order to identify structural sensitivity based on persistent homological patterns. That's what we're proposing to do.
So the idea is that as you change the parameter, the sheaf goes and adds.
So the idea is to construct an ensemble of different interaction networks, parameterized by, for example, the varying reliability of the sensor, the degree of similarity of two data fields, that's quantitatively or qualitatively, I should say qualitatively, to include or exclude an entire sensor. So I might have this one, but then next to it, I might have this one, where I leave off this interaction, and therefore I lose the triangle as well. And I might want to compare these two against each other and see what the persistent pattern is, like in the radar example. Or I might vary this quantitatively, so I have a third color, and a third color. All your colors here are basically the same. They got different kinds of blue. Not so helpful. So I might have a third color coming in here, like 0.5, where the strength of this connection would vary between 0 and 1. And I'd make an ensemble of simplicial complexes along those lines and then look for the persistent patterns. That's the actual proposal we're trying to do. So that's a close maybe answer to your question.
Can't you get some kind of a partial order or lattice structure of sheaves? Or at least simplicial complexes? Saying that the one is part of the other?
Well, certainly there's an order on simplicial complexes by inclusion, yes.
Yeah.
And in fact, what's called what's it called? Chain complex. A chain complex is a total order, not a partial order, on simplicial complexes that is this, this is a chain complex, and this is a total order. Of course, you can combine multiple total orders to make a partial order. That's one way to approach it. But yeah, you're in the right universe, for sure. So that's really my pitch to the systems people out there, is to add this to your, I agree with Johnson, this should be added to the repertoire of systems modeling things. It's harder to, these are not simple, these are harder to work with, but you gain because you're able to represent the complexity, the true complexity of the underlying system much more directly.
Can you say a few more words about the dimension, the varying dimensionality? Because I find some similarity. I understand it's very different. Some similarity to manifolds, but in manifolds, the increasing dimensionality in different parts of the manifold has a kind of persistency in meaning along the.
I'm not sure I'm following you. So I thought manifolds, I don't know what it means to vary dimension across a manifold.
No, let's see how.
Yep.
I thought manifolds were all the same dimension. I thought an entire manifold is of a dimension, no?
No, manifold can partly be one-dimensional, in other parts.
I do not know this. That's cool.
I also didn't know manifolds would have several dimensionalities.
In different
How can that be? If you have
different
a-
partitions of manifolds can be described in different coordinate systems, and also the dimensionality is not consistent along the partitions.
Oh.
But maybe I'm.
That's a theory I don't know.
I mean, I'm not good at this kind of mathematics. I'm really not. Like when I got my C+ in real analysis, I was trying to avoid all this stuff from that point forward. So my understanding of this is very naive. But my understanding was that a manifold is simply a object that exists in a certain dimension, like Euclidean dimension. Like I could have a two-dimensional manifold. A two-dimensional Euclidean manifold would just be some kind of surface that has a certain shape or structure to it, right? So I don't know what it would mean to take a two-dimensional Euclidean surface inside a three-dimensional Euclidean space and have part of that be in 3 dimensions and part of that be in 1 dimension. I don't know what that means.
Maybe go back to maybe the analogy is not. When you go from 1-dimensional to 2-dimensional to 3-dimensional and so on, what
Here.
actually the number of dimensions? What do they represent? They represent something. It is not.
They represent the number of shared values.
It does not create a continuity between the different points. So if you have, for example, a triangle, you don't have a meaning to a point within the triangle.
No, there are no points within the triangle. It's the entire triangle. It's not
It's
composed of
the
points.
entire triangle, and
Yeah. No, it's in fact
it's a qualitative difference.
so there's the mathematicians use two terms. There's simplicial complex and then there's abstract simplicial complex. A abstract simplicial complex is a pure set theoretical notion. In an abstract simplicial complex, the triangle is simply the 3 points. It's the set of the 3 points. When you build a non-abstract, a concrete, then you represent the abstract as, actually what you really represent it as is in 3 space, you represent it as that triangle with unit coordinates. So, but that's a mapping. It's a bijective mapping from the set of 3 things forming the triangle to this particular, and then you can talk about a point inside that surface.
But
But
if
it's
I
not the same.
understand you well, any simplicity of concept can be represented as a set of subsets.
Correct. That's right. That's what we were talking about before. So going back to the foundations, an abstract simplicial complex is a set system, meaning a set of subsets that's closed under subset of it. So this, let's give these points names, A, B, C, D. This, as an abstract simplicial complex, is a class, meaning a set of subsets consisting of the set B, C, D, and all of its subsets. BC, BD,
Okay.
Now I
CD.
get what you mean.
Now it's
And
become clearer.
singleton B, singleton C, singleton D, but I'm not done. That's just this triangle. Also included is the edge AB and the singleton set A. So as this structure is the abstract simplicial complex here.
Okay, understood.
Now we represent each this.
The abstract is equivalent with the simplicial complex. It's just a different representation. They are equivalent. They are.
Now the way you I think there's a name for it. It's like the canonical or the representative or something like that. Let's pretend it's canonical. So the canonical simplicial complex for this abstract simplicial complex, I actually can't draw because it would be a 4-dimensional object. So maybe it's go back to the other side. Maybe it's actually 4-dimensional. I don't know. Because it would be this triangle plus you would have another attached to here coming out in the 4th dimension. You'd have another point coming out to 0, 1 from that. No, that's not right. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what I'm saying here. But what's the question?
Is the abstract representation there and the graphical representation there, are they completely equivalent?
Yes.
Or does the one have more information
No.
than the other? So actually we don't need the simplicity of complexes if we know that we can use a set of subsets that are closed for inclusion.
Definition. Abstract simplicial complex is a set system closed under subset. That's it.
Now I really get the definition, I can grasp 100%.
No, and then you can make comparisons. If you have huge structures like this, you can start to create, to find some patterns inside, which is how these sets of sets are relating to each other to recognize structures that are...
Notice, because it's closed under subset, the entire simplicial complex is generated from its maximum faces. So it's sufficient to represent this simply as the set system BCD and AB. Because everything else is driven from being a subset of one of these.
All the rest are...
So it's actually, you can actually think of it as a set system into which is unioned all of the subsets that are present. So that's this maximum face here is the triangle, and this maximum face there is the edge.
And then you can discover partial orders and overlaps and things like this.
Well, I mean, the whole thing lives in the Boolean lattice, right? Because all set systems live in the Boolean lattice. And so every set system determines a partial order, up to a partial order. It's actually a sublattice, and every sublattice is a partial order. So, in that sense, yes. I mean, it's stronger than a partial order because it's a sublattice of the Boolean lattice, which is a very strong structure.
This is powerful, yes.
Yeah.
I can imagine. I love this.
I love this little example. I was telling Francis the other day, I'm reading this hairy book on topological signal analysis, and I'm watching this guy's lectures, and I'm kind of following along, and yeah, okay, that makes sense, and that's a sheaf morphism. Yeah, okay, fine. And then I read this little example, and say, oh yeah, well, that makes sense. And then I met the guy, I was meeting with the guy, and I told him, hey, I was doing okay, I thought I was doing okay, but then I really got it once. He says, oh yeah, my wife made me put that in. Now, she's a mathematician too, so she's astounding. But yeah, it was.
I think Joslyn has more of these examples. Lots of a pure mathematician. The other guy.
I think you will.
I saw that. It's $150.
I have a draft paper copy, but yeah.
No, I need digital anyway. I'm not going to risk it. But I'll see. Is it out yet? Is that the point?
I haven't yet read it. I have to find my copy. He gave it to me in confidence at the conference. And, yeah.
Is he a systems guy otherwise?
And you can watch the video.
Yeah. He's got a video. He's got a video. Oh, your video.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Well, yeah, his presentation here was not so good. There was some else he gave at the conference in Barcelona.
About the first impression.
Yeah.
But he also has some papers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like I've been around this stuff for a while, but like I say, I was first exposed to this in about 2001 when I was doing some work at New Mexico State University, working with Reinhard Laubenbacher and May Gerke, and they were doing things in chew spaces and this kind of stuff, and it freaked me out because it was way over my head at the time, and I saw the complexity and some of the power in it. And it sat in the back of my brain for years until I came across it again relatively recently, and I sat down with this guy, Michael, and he convinced me not only of the value of this for my work, but also the value in general for finite topology. So, as long as we're on this topic, which I enjoy so much, so here we see this as a set system is a set of sets. A set system which is closed under subset is a simplicial complex, and we're seeing that here, which means that it's generated by its maximum covers, its maximum faces, rather, which is here.
How do you find the maximum phases easily in such a thing?
You simply look for anything that's not a subset of anything else. So singleton B is included here, so you get rid of it. BD is included here, so you get rid of it too. Graphically, you just look for the there's a good way to look at this graphically. This is it's too many. It's a 4 cube, so it's too big to really show easily. But there's a Boolean lattice here. So this is A B C A B D A C D B C D, and then down here empty set A B C D. Here A B C D. I don't want to do all the stuff in between, but you get the point, right? All the subsets are represented here. I could do it. Anyway, it's 16. It's a hypercube, right? With two 3 cubes glued together. What you do is you find the maximum face here, BCD, and the maximum face here, AB, and you simply say everything below it is the simplicial complex. So these are everything below it. These are called principal ideals. So it's a union of principal ideals of the Boolean lattice. That's what a simplicial complex is. So, what's a finite topology? And once I figured this out, it sort of fit together for me. Every collection of sets, every subset of this Boolean lattice is a set system. That's what they're called. Just a collection of. It's also called a class in certain parts of mathematics. So a class is a set system, is a set of sets. Basic, right? Therefore, a simplicial complex is a class closed under subset. Well, a finite topology is simply a class covered under union and intersection. That's all it is. So you form a set of sets. So let's say A, B, and CD, and you find those points, A, B, and C, D, and then you form all the intersections, and actually let's do a little bit, let's say A, C, D. Their intersection is A, their union is A, B, C, D. So this is a finite topology. The sets in question are the open sets, and then the closed sets are all their complements. So these are the open sets. The closed sets are all their complements. So the complement to AB is, well, this is a bad example. No, it's not. AC. No, it's not. It's a good example. Okay. So the complement to this is CD, and the complement to this is just the singleton set B. So CD is down here, and the singleton set B is there. And these are...
The unions and intersections are also closed.
And the unions and intersections are also closed. That's right. And so in particular, this is BCD. It's all, the closed sets are also closed under union and intersection. So in particular, BCD and the empty set. Oh, and I'm sorry, the empty set is always included, as is the universe. So they're always open. They're always open and closed. Anyway, you get the point. So, so I've got a class closed under subset. I've got a class closed under intersection and under intersection and union. What's left? What other basic closure operators can you bring to bear on a class? Closed under complementation? That's some sort of converse to the topology. That's not motivating in and of itself. That's kind of a converse to the topology. Closed under complement by itself isn't very powerful. I know what's left. So once I realized this, first of all, I've been working with set systems forever. So for example, in my thesis work, where I was doing possibility theory and possibilistic systems, Dempster-Schafer evidence theory, that's dealing with probability distributions over a class. You take a class, and you simply put probabilities on all of these subsets. Boom, you got Dempster-Schafer evidence theory right there. And it turns out that I was dealing with various lattice theoretical properties of the classes. So for example, if the class has a certain shape, if they all live on the singletons, or if they all live on a chain going up and down the lattice, certain things happen. I didn't realize it at the time because I didn't have the mathematics, but then I figured it out later on. When I did a lot of work in ontology analysis, and looking at the class hierarchies of ontologies, which are large partial orders, living in the same structure. It's not a Boolean lattice, but a large hierarchical structure. So that's also a set system. So I've been dealing with these things forever, and they're the foundations of so much systems theory. I mean, binary relations and set systems are about as fundamental as you can get. So what I say, it filled a hole for me, it's in this sense closed under a subset, closed under intersection and union inside a Boolean lattice, which is a structure that the Boolean lattice and binary relation are like the building blocks of everything. You see, I'm making Johnson's argument better maybe than Johnson did, I don't know.
Yeah, probably a little bit not there.
Probably
Well, on a more abstract level,
For me, at least,
he
not convincing.
gave more examples, but the examples didn't really convey the power of it.
So there's, I mean, this is, I know these are necessary pieces, and I'm starting to think they might be sufficient pieces. I don't know. We were talking before, so what, set system, what is a set system also? An undirected hypergraph.
Well, it's a way of making distinctions. You have a universe of elements, and you make distinctions, and these are your subsets.
Right.
And out of distinctions, you can generate other
That's right.
distinctions by intersection and union and complement and so on. But if you start with a limited number of distinctions, you can only generate a limited number of other distinctions, and the others, they are not being distinguished. That's basically what the structure is.
Right.
The fact that you distinguish certain things and do not distinguish other things. But the problem with distinction is it's all static. It's all Boolean, it's all logic. There's no dynamics in it. That's why I insist on something like the chemical organization thing, where you have the error, where you have the reaction, where you have something happening, something new coming
Oh, that's
out.
fine. Nobody would object to that, of course.
But of course, this can be combined. You may be able to analyze, for example, the chemical organizations using some of this formalism. Because your chemical organization can also be represented as sets, but they have an additional structure. They have the dynamical structure.
So what I said was that this basic thing, this set system, this basic thing, whether it's closed under whatever, if it's not closed under anything, a basic set system is a hypergraph. But it's an undirected hypergraph. You guys use directed hypergraphs. So in a directed hypergraph, you take, by the way, I'll now take the opportunity, I wasn't going to say this before because it wasn't all that relevant, but as long as we're at this point in the discussion, I would state my objection, not to you guys, but to the people that misuse the term directed hypergraph. Because, we know that an edge in a simple graph is an unordered pair, represented as the set AB. We also know that an edge in a directed graph goes from A to B, which is represented as an ordered pair, which I use angle brackets for, I would use parentheses for, AB. So, as I generalize, and I say that an undirected hyperedge is the set ABC, I want to go and talk about what is a directed hyperedge. A directed hyperedge is properly a collection, ABC, that is permuted in a particular way, has a particular order attached to it. So it's a total order on a hyperedge. Should be what a directed hyperedge is. But y'all, the people that you read to create this, actually they don't do that. What they do is they say it's A, B, C, where it's partitioned. And one side are your inputs, and the other side are your outputs.
Yeah, that's what I prefer.
Yeah. Well, I call that a directed hyperedge, and I call that something else. It's fine, but whatever. So I just want to throw that out there for a moment. But the point is that it's more information than is just in the set system. This distinction between inputs and outputs in your hyperedge, you're maybe claiming is sufficient to motivate the dynamics. Because what you do is you say, oh, these are my ins and these are my outs. And therefore, I'm going to assert a time dimension onto that.
No, the time dimension should emerge from the directedness. The directedness does not imply that there is a linear order. The directedness allows you to create all kinds of cycles and all kinds of complicated structures. Time is not at all trivial.
Well, here's a cycle in my static structure.
Yeah, in static structures, cycles are not no problem. In dynamic structures, they become a problem because you lose the
I'm not sure what you mean. So in your directed hypergraph model, where does the dynamics come? How do you know what happened before and what happens next?
Well, it's just the order. What's input is before, what's output is after. But if you have a cycle, then it means that you don't have an absolute order.
Why can't I just flip it around and say that these are my outputs, these are my inputs, and those are my outputs?
Because by definition there is an input and an output. That's the assumption of an ordered pair. That You could flip them around, but then you have something different.
Well, no, the point is that there's a duality attached to that. So if I give you an arbitrary undirected graph, here's an arbitrary undirected graph, right? Now there's multiple orders that are present on that. There's multiple pointings. There's a combinatorially large number of pointings. I could stick arrowheads. Here's an arrowhead going this way, and this way, and this way, and this way, and that establishes my flow. But I might as well have also done it that way. And for k edges, there'll be 2 to the k orders. Well, the point is that for every static structure, there's 2 to the k possible dynamic orders.
Precisely.
Right.
Precisely. That's why people like to have the static structure, because it's easier. Because they don't have to remember what the particular order is of all these different.
So here's my point. For the hypergraph models in the same way, if I've got a hyperedge and a hyperedge and they overlap, so I've got elements, right? I've got a collection of hyperedges which share elements. You're saying that this is going to be an input here and this is going to be an output there for that one, but then this is going to be. How does that work? We were talking about this the other day. Does the entire input have to match to that? Help me out here. So you've got, this is one of your hyperedges, right? So I've got multiple ins and multiple outs.
Oh, yeah.
And then this is the edge itself is represented here. And this is my input. And I've got X, Y, Z on my inputs and A, B, C on my outputs, right? So that means the entire hyperedge is X, Y, Z, A.
There is no ordering of X, Y, Z. There is no ordering A, B, C, but there is an order from X, Y, Z to A, B, C.
That's right. So then, but then the next edge, the next one downstream might be A and B going in and W and Z going out. So this entire edge doesn't need it. So that is what I've got here more or less. Okay. So anyway, my point is that I could flip all these arrows around as well. Instead of the direction going this way, I might have the direction going that way instead. So there's no
something fundamental.
So just making the distinction between inputs and outputs does not generate the dynamics because you don't have the pointing. The fact that there's a combinatorially large number of pointings in a binary graph carries over that there's an arbitrary number of combinatorially large number of pointings in a hypergraph as well. Yes? Well, here, I've got my XYZs going in and my ABCs going out. I might as well just flip that back the other way and say, it's the ABCs going in and the XYZs going out, as long as you keep the distinction between the ABCs and the XYZs.
It would still be a difference, because by definition, the arrow is meaningful, it's essential. For me, the XYZs are less important than the arrow that connects them.
Okay, so what you're saying is that the directed graph has a dynamics as well. The directed non-hypergraph.
Yeah, okay. I assume by default that everything has a direction. That there are things that come before and there are things that come after. There are ifs and there are dones. I see everywhere in nature, in my experience, everywhere around me, I see ifs, dones, no, dones. There is an order.
Mm-hmm. I'm just trying to think of the mathematical.
It's more difficult to work with that with the mathematics we have. Does not mean that we can just say, yeah, but it's just a complication on a normal graph.
I was trying to make the discussion came from starting with the difference between set systems. And I'm trying to remember the origin of this particular point of discussion.
Yeah, what I'm trying to do with Evo and with Weaver was to start from the reactions, that means the arrows, and then kind of derive in a sense the elements by putting partitions on them and giving them properties and merging some of them, and maybe it's completely the other way around. Set theory starts from the elements and then puts structures on top of these elements. I start from the structures, which in the simplest case are these arrows, and then I try to derive the properties of the elements they connect.
And what is category theory?
category theory is
Just
a
something
theory of
similar,
more
but
purposes
not,
and transitive relations. So, I couldn't answer that until I get an example, and maybe now, I don't know if now's a good time, but I'd love to get an example from you, that process you just described, starting with arrows, and then trying to derive elements from a collection of arrows.
Well,
I think that begs the
I
question.
have a draft text in which I suggest some solutions and ask some questions. I can send it on to you.
Okay. Because I think, to get to your question, category theory, I think, still assumes the entities.
Yeah, objects and arrows.
Yeah, from pure arrows, I don't think you can.
Yeah, you can do lots of things. You can build lots of things out of pure
Your arrows surely have points on each end, yes? No? Do you have vertices on the ends of these arrows, or are we just?
Yeah, but the
just
vertices are not fixed. The vertices is what you start out with, and then you can change them once you analyze a thing.
So they're identified only in virtue of their participation on the arrow.
Yeah.
So it's not x connects to y; it's the left side of arrow one versus the right side of arrow one. You identify them only in virtue of their position on. Well, that's what we're doing in our starification. Right? So you say arrow 1, I've got arrow 2, or let's say arrow A and arrow B. Arrow A has a left side, arrow A has a right side, arrow B has a left side, arrow B has a right side. And then it might or might not be the case, or rather if it is the case, that the right side of arrow B equals left side of, the right side of arrow A equals left side of arrow B, then and only then can you say, well, this is actually.
Yeah. That's kind of a very simple case of it, yeah. But I also might like to see that there are intersections between AR and B left and so on. So that's the most tricky part I'm getting to.
Okay, cool.
Maybe we should go and drink a beer.
I like beer. I came here for the
There
beer.
is a freeze here where
I was told I'd have beer.
You can also use these shifts as elements in some dynamics, yes? It's only static.
Well, that's Francis's challenge. It's interesting. This business that I went through of building the sheaf. See, I got arrows. I got arrowheads, right? I got like we're talking. I got directions.
Seem to.
I got directions, but I get rid of them. Look, see, they go away. And furthermore, Michael didn't put those arrowheads on. That's for me.
Because the situation that you tried to represent on the first end was static, but you can imagine that this mathematical kind of structuring can also serve in describing dynamic systems. Just, for example, you made at a certain slide you say that reliability of sensor, for example.
Right.
This is something which is dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
It can say a lot or say nothing. And
what this ignores is that any sensor that establishes some fact, some piece of data, it's a process. It's not given. You have to establish it at a certain moment. Some information comes out of something via a sensor and is put into your graph. It's always a process. You make abstraction of the process when you make these kind of models, like most mathematicians do, but that's not how nature is. Without the process, there wouldn't be any data, there wouldn't be any information.
it's like when I'm thinking, sometimes I have maybe 10 facts that I know each of them separately, but at a certain moment I find a connection and suddenly they become structured and connected to each other. And this is a kind of a process where some disparate points may become a sheaf like this. Because I suddenly saw the relations, what connects to what connects partly, and what does not connect at all. So it seems that
It's a good challenge. What role these sheaf theoretical or any set theoretical description can play in dynamic systems is a good. I mean, I gave Francis a cheap answer the other day by simply saying, well, any collection of static descriptions which is totally ordered can represent a dynamic process. Like I say, it's a cheap way out.
That's a cheap way that everybody uses.
Well, but there's something, that doesn't mean it's not a...
It's useful because it's being used, but the problem is that there are fundamental unsolved problems that haven't been solved for 300 or 400 years since that method exists, of seeing a process as a series of static descriptions that since Newton basically the world is being described like that.
How about Cantor, who adds new sets by the sets that he has? In the sense that you start with a closed topology and then sort of open it up by making new topologies from the things that you have. Then you can enter into an endless world of open dynamics.
Either it's specified which sets you can generate and you can say yes that they are already there, or it's not specified and then indeed somebody outside of the system will have to make the choice, now I'm going to generate this one and I'm going to generate that one. So in the one case there is no dynamics, in the other case the dynamics has to be put in from the outside. It's not the fact that it allows you to generate this, that it means that it represents the process of generation.
Well, I want to thank you all for listening. This has been stimulating, really.
And I want to thank you for presenting a very thought-provoking seminar.
Thank you.